My wife told me her mother was having trouble breathing, and her father could barely stand. Because I had a board call that morning, my daughter offered to drive with her. That should have sounded normal. It almost did. But 40 minutes later, I stepped quietly into my mother-in-law's hallway and heard my wife ask a stranger in a calm, professional voice how many more documented episodes it would take before a judge believed I was no longer fit to run my own company. I remember stopping so suddenly my shoulder hit the doorframe. I remember the sting. I remember the ridiculous detail of a framed watercolor hanging crooked in the hallway while my life bent in a much uglier direction. And I remember this most clearly of all. The stranger did not sound shocked. He sounded prepared. He said, with the journal, the medication history, and 2 more observed incidents, emergency temporary control should be straightforward. My daughter answered him before my wife did. Then we need to move faster. That was the moment I understood I had not walked into a family emergency. I had walked into a schedule, a timetable, a coordinated plan built by the 2 people I loved most and a man I had never invited into my life. And somewhere inside that plan was a version of me they were already trying to write. Confused, unsafe, unstable, too impaired to sign my own name. Too unreliable to protect my own company. Too compromised to stop whatever they meant to do next. If you have ever had somebody lie to your face for months, maybe years, you know the strange thing that happens in the first seconds after the truth breaks open. You do not explode. Not right away. First, you become incredibly still. Your whole body seems to understand before your mind catches up. The air changes, sound sharpens, words stop feeling abstract and start feeling like objects. I stood there in that hallway with the smell of coffee and lemon cleaner in my nose, listening to my wife and my daughter discuss my legal extinction in the kitchen, while my in-laws sat healthy and cheerful in the living room watching a game show. My name is Richard Halston. I am 62 years old. At the time this began, I owned Halston Freight and Supply, a regional materials company outside Tacoma, with 3 yards, 68 employees, and a reputation built over 3 decades of showing up when other people made excuses. I had a wife of 31 years, a daughter I thought still called me when things got real, a lake house I had paid off early, a line of credit I never abused, a life insurance policy I almost never thought about, and I had one additional thing I would eventually learn matters very much to predators. I had a mild head injury 8 months earlier. Not dramatic, not life-changing, not the sort of thing any rational person would use as the foundation of a private coup. I slipped on black ice behind our Bellevue office on a January morning, hit the back of my head on a curb, spent 1 night in the hospital for observation, and walked out with a headache, 6 stitches, and doctor's orders to take it easy for a few weeks. I recovered, mostly. For a month or 2, I misplaced words now and then, forgot why I had walked into a room once or twice, mixed up a lunch appointment. Nothing grand, nothing terrifying, nothing outside the range of what half the men my age already joke about before refilling their coffee. My neurologist cleared me. My headaches faded. My work resumed. My wife Marianne said I was lucky. My daughter Chloe said I needed to be more careful. Then Chloe found Daniel Voss. Or maybe Daniel found us. That question would matter later. He was introduced as a cognitive performance consultant, not a neurologist, not a psychiatrist, not even a therapist in the traditional sense. He specialized, Chloe said, in recovery planning, executive stabilization, and post-traumatic cognitive support. That sounded like the kind of phrase designed in a room with glass walls and expensive water. I laughed the first time I heard it. Marianne did not. She said it might help to have somebody objective keep an eye on things for a while. She said I had been more irritable since the fall. She said I was sleeping badly. She said there was no harm in support. There is a sentence I have thought about 1,000 times since then. There is always harm in support that arrives with a secret invoice attached. Before I tell you how they tried to take my company, my house, and eventually my life, let me say one thing plainly. I am not telling this story because revenge made me noble. It did not. There were nights I wanted something much darker and much simpler than justice. I am telling it because people like Daniel survive on one belief, that decent people will always hesitate longer than they do, that we will question ourselves before we question them, that we will worry about overreacting while they are already moving money, forging signatures, drafting incapacity petitions, and deciding how much sedative fits into a glass without leaving an obvious trail. I hesitated too long, but not forever. And by the time this story ends, the same dining room table where they expected me to surrender control of everything would become the place where each of them destroyed their own lie with their own mouths. That was my revenge. Not screaming, not swinging, not blood, precision. And the most brutal part of all was this. I let them believe they had already won. The morning everything broke began with eggs, rain against glass, and the kind of harmless domestic noise people later remember with unnecessary tenderness. Our kitchen faced east, so when Seattle weather cooperated, the first light always came in silver and flat across the island. That morning it was all clouds and soft drizzle, the backyard cedar fence dark with rain, the herb pot slick and shining. Marianne was at the stove in one of my old Navy sweatshirts, moving with the efficient rhythm she had developed over decades of doing 5 things while speaking about a 6th. Chloe sat at the island with her laptop open, one foot tucked under her, scrolling through presentation slides between bites of toast. She was 31 then, sharp, beautiful, restless. She had my dark hair and Marianne's ability to make concern look like competence. At the time, I would have told you she worked too hard and trusted too little. Now I would say something more accurate. She learned early how to look sincere while calculating angles. I had a 9:30 board call that morning and a lunch with 2 industrial clients from Everett. Chloe knew it, Marianne knew it. We all knew it because my schedule had become family weather. They could tell from my calendar whether I would be patient at dinner, distracted on Saturday, or asleep before the second glass of wine. That had been true for years. It is not an excuse, just part of the truth. I worked too much. I told myself it was for the company, for our future, for everybody. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes work was also where I went to avoid subtler failures that did not fit onto spreadsheets. Marianne had been patient about that longer than most women would have been. She taught music for 12 years when Chloe was little, then shifted into private lessons and local arts fundraising after we had enough money not to calculate every grocery run against mortgage dates. She was warm in public, dry in private, and brilliant at making guests feel more interesting than they really were. At her best, she could make a whole room feel gently better than it had any right to. At her worst, she turned quiet in a way that made everybody else work harder without quite understanding why. Before the head injury, our marriage had not been on fire. It had also not been dying. We were in that middle country long marriages often reach. Shared habits, mutual shorthand, old injuries layered over genuine loyalty, enough affection to stay recognizable, enough neglect to become dangerous if somebody new learned where to press. Daniel Voss knew exactly where to press. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That morning, Chloe was talking about a marketing pitch. Marianne asked whether I had taken my blood pressure pill. I said yes, though I had forgotten and took it with coffee after saying so. Chloe teased me for proving her point about post-concussion organization. Marianne smiled, but not all the way. That is another detail hindsight poisons. At the time, I thought it was a joke. Later, I would remember how often jokes appeared around me once Daniel entered our orbit. Dad forgot his keys again. Dad called the rental yard by the old manager's name. Dad said Thursday when it was Wednesday. Dad almost put orange juice in the pantry. Normal things, harmless things, human things. But repetition changes color when somebody is collecting them. That was Daniel's gift. He never accused. He documented. In February, he started coming by the house once or twice a week under the banner of supporting routine, reducing stress, and observing recovery patterns. He brought polished notebooks, used calm language, and praised every small improvement in a tone that made resistance sound immature. If I snapped at him, he called it fatigue. If I ignored him, he called it withdrawal. If I laughed at the whole arrangement, he said defensiveness is common after mild traumatic injury. Everything became evidence inside his vocabulary. Marianne liked that vocabulary because it gave shape to unease she had not known how to name. Chloe loved it because it turned family feeling into leverage. "Dad, nobody's saying you're falling apart," she said one night in March after I forgot the name of a warehouse supervisor's son. "We're saying you went through something and you don't have to power through it alone." There is no clean defense against concern when concern has been weaponized, especially if part of you fears there may be something real inside it. That is the part people miss when they imagine men like me. They think pride makes us invulnerable. Actually, pride makes us easier to trap, because we would rather quietly test ourselves against the accusation than openly say the accusation is insulting. So I did what many decent fools do. I cooperated just enough to make the machine stronger. I let Daniel run baseline exercises. I let him ask memory questions over coffee. I let Marianne keep a sleep journal because she said it helped. I let Chloe talk me into moving some company signing authority temporarily during recovery season, just in case I needed flexibility. Just in case. 3 of the ugliest words ever invented. By April, Daniel knew which names I reached for slower when tired. By May, Marianne had started telling people at fundraisers I was doing better, but still not quite myself. By June, Chloe was gently suggesting I think about succession planning more seriously. And by September, the morning I followed them to her parents' house, I was living inside a story they had been drafting for months while still believing I was the author of my own life. That morning, Marianne's phone rang just after 8. She looked at the screen. Color left her face. She turned away to answer. Mom, what happened? She listened for maybe 15 seconds, then braced one hand on the counter as if steadying herself. What do you mean he fell, and she can't catch her breath? Chloe was already closing her laptop. I stood up. What's wrong? Marianne looked at me with wet eyes. Dad slipped in the den. Mom says he's dizzy, and now she's panicking so badly she can't breathe properly. I reached for my keys immediately. I'm coming. No, she said too fast. Too fast. At the time, it registered only as fear. You have your board call, she added, and if this turns into a hospital situation, one of us needs to stay clear-headed here. I'll go with Mom, Chloe said, already grabbing her coat. Grandpa listens to me better when he gets stubborn anyway. Everything moved quickly after that. The speed was part of the design, though I did not know it then. Marianne kissed my cheek with one hand still shaking. We'll call the second we get there. Chloe squeezed my arm. Stay by your phone, okay? Don't start driving like a maniac unless we actually need you. I watched them back out of the driveway into the gray morning with taillights blurred by rain and felt something small and ugly settle beneath my ribs. Not fear, wrongness. I tried to work through it, opened my laptop, joined the call, reviewed quarterly shipping exposure, nodded at numbers on a screen, but my attention kept slipping. At 9:12, Marianne texted, They're stable, talking to someone here, we'll update soon. Talking to someone. I read that twice. My father-in-law, Harold Whitaker, did not talk to someone when he fell. He either refused help, swore at furniture, or demanded aspirin. And my mother-in-law, June, had a dramatic streak, but not enough to turn a dizzy spell into a meeting. I left the board call at 9:24 with a lie about a facility issue, grabbed my jacket, and drove south without telling anyone. The fall on the ice did not ruin my life. That would have been simpler. Actual catastrophe announces itself. Blood, sirens, news at the door, a before and after everyone can agree on. What I got instead was ambiguity. Just enough injury to create concern, just enough recovery to create doubt, just enough visible imperfection to let a liar build a kingdom on top of it. I remember that January morning very clearly now, probably because everybody later acted as if memory itself had become unreliable in my presence. The loading dock behind our Bellevue office had iced over overnight, in a way facilities should have caught and did not. I was stepping off the curb with coffee in one hand and my phone in the other, looking at a freight delay message from Boise, when my heel went out from under me. No drama, just impact. The coffee flew. My phone cracked. The back of my head hit the curb harder than I would have guessed possible from such a stupid fall. I came to in the ambulance annoyed, which is a very male kind of luck. Annoyance means you are alive enough to resent inconvenience. The ER doctor called it a mild concussion. The scan was clean, observation overnight, headaches likely, sensitivity to light, some temporary processing slowdown possible. Marianne cried when she saw the stitches. Chloe went straight into action mode. She arranged medication trays, ordered blackout curtains for the bedroom, moved my morning meetings for 2 weeks without asking. Started sending me article after article about executive recovery, inflammation, sleep hygiene, and post-concussion cognitive drift. I found it overbearing. Now I understand it was also reconnaissance. The first month after the fall, the symptoms were real enough to matter. I got tired faster. Noise irritated me. I forgot names more than usual. Once, midway through a call, the word pallet would not arrive and I had to say wooden shipping platform like a fool explaining freight to a second grader. I hated that. Not because it was catastrophic, because it was humiliating in the tiny, intimate way cognitive slips can be humiliating. You do not grieve them grandly. You test yourself against them privately. Did I always do that? Was that slower than before? How many times have I missed that name? Why did that sentence feel muddy? That is the territory where men like Daniel thrive. They do not need to invent every symptom. They only need to stand beside ordinary recovery and narrate it darker than it is. Chloe found him 3 weeks after the accident. At least that is the story she told. A friend of a friend. A specialist in executive stabilization. Someone who had helped a tech founder after a skiing injury in Utah and another finance partner after a car wreck in California. Not a doctor. Better, Chloe said. Someone practical. That should have made me laugh him out of the house. Instead, I let him come because my headache was bad that day, and Marianne looked hopeful, and I was tired of being the difficult one in my own recovery. Daniel arrived with flowers for Marianne. That detail mattered more later than it did then. Not wine. Not something for me. Flowers for my wife. Subtle, civilized. A man entering through the emotional front door first. He sat in our living room in a charcoal sweater and asked me questions about sleep, concentration, irritability, work habits, appetite, and what he called identity pressure. Identity pressure. He spoke as if all human experience were a complicated but manageable spreadsheet if only you used the correct headings. At one point he said, "Men with your kind of responsibility often confuse continuity with indispensability." I remember almost liking him then, because manipulative people do not always begin with nonsense. They begin with insights shallow enough to be broadly true and deep enough to feel personal. He never once told me I was damaged. He said strain, recovery lag, cognitive congestion, executive overcompensation. He made every weakness sound temporary and every temporary thing sound measurable. That is what won Marianne. Not authority, composure. By the second session, he had us all speaking his language. Marianne would say, "You seem more overloaded today." Chloe would say, "Let's reduce variables." I would say, "Fine, 10 more minutes and then I'm done with this." Nothing in those exchanges sounded insane. That is why they were dangerous. By week 6, Daniel had me doing memory drills over breakfast. Not because I wanted to, because refusing them now looked like insecurity. List these 5 words back. Tell me what you had for lunch Tuesday. Repeat the sequence after me. Name 3 cities where your company has no active yard. Subtract 7 from 100 out loud. It was humiliating in the quiet, respectable way. Therapy games are humiliating when you never agreed they should exist in your kitchen in the first place. But I did well enough on them that Daniel changed tactics. He stopped emphasizing performance and started emphasizing pattern. "It's not about how you do in a calm setting," he told Marianne once while I was in the next room, pretending not to hear. "It's about inconsistency under demand." Inconsistency under demand. That became the bridge, because what executive in his 60s under stress is perfectly consistent under demand. Not one, not ever. He did not need me broken. He needed me variable. Once he understood that, everything around me began to get a little more chaotic in ways I could not prove at the time. Wrong documents mixed into the right stack, appointments moved by an hour, sleep interrupted by accidentally loud phone calls, 3 questions from different people at once. Meals delayed, medication trays rearranged for convenience. Nothing dramatic, just enough disorder to worsen exactly the kinds of small lapses later entered into Marianne's journal as evidence. Did Chloe invent that layer herself? Did Daniel coach it? Did Marianne notice and refuse to see? I still do not know every answer. But by spring, the environment around me had become strangely better at producing the very symptoms they were tracking. That is why I reject anyone who says this was just greed. No, it was conditioning. The money mattered, the company mattered, the policy mattered. But to get all that cleanly, they first needed a version of me who could be spoken over without the room revolting. Daniel built that version carefully. He asked for my routines. Then he entered them. He asked about my work. Then he positioned himself as translator between my family and the pressures I carried. He complimented Marianne's endurance, praised Chloe's maturity, and in every conversation, subtly, slowly, he moved me 1 inch away from being the central authority in my own life. The most revealing moment from those early months did not feel revealing at all when it happened. I had forgotten a dentist appointment and came home irritated with myself. Daniel happened to be there drinking tea with Marianne after what he called a check-in session. I said, "I forgot something stupid." He smiled gently and answered, "Nothing is stupid when it repeats." That sentence stayed with me. Later, when Teresa read it in one of my notes, she said, "That's it. That's the whole con. He wasn't observing repetition. He was creating significance." Exactly. He took ordinary human embarrassment and gave it legal posture. If he had walked into our life shouting that I was unfit, I would have thrown him out. If Chloe had demanded control of the company in February, the board would have laughed her into the parking lot. If Marianne had openly said she no longer trusted my judgment, I would have fought like hell right then. So they did something smarter and dirtier. They made the abnormal arrive wearing concern, systems, and patience. By the time I recognized the costume, it had been hanging in my own house for months. The Whitakers lived in an older brick ranch in Mercer Island, the same house Marianne grew up in, the same house where every family Christmas had been staged around too much food and June's conviction that all side dishes deserved their own serving spoons. I knew the creak in the front gate. I knew the smell of the hallway. I knew where Harold kept emergency batteries and the exact cabinet June used for the good napkins nobody was allowed to touch except on holidays. That familiarity is part of what made the betrayal feel surgical. I was not walking into a strange place. I was walking into a place that had taught me trust. I parked half a block away because the feeling in my chest had sharpened by then, and I did not want them seeing my truck through the front window. Rain dripped from oak leaves onto my shoulders as I crossed the lawn. The gate stood open. Harold never left it open. The den curtains were half drawn. Light glowed warm from the kitchen. I expected ambulance noise. Voices raised in panic, at least the heavy silence that follows actual illness. Instead, I heard laughter. Game show laughter first, then Harold's low, amused cough, then June saying, "No, the one on the left. Obviously the one on the left." I stopped under the front eave and simply stared through the narrow gap in the curtain. Harold sat in his recliner with a blanket over his knees and the remote in his hand. June had a bowl of grapes. Both looked healthy enough to outlive me out of sheer stubbornness. No oxygen, no collapse, no crisis, just television. My wife had lied. I did not even fully feel the sentence at first. It moved through me like cold water. I opened the front door carefully because it had never latched quite right in damp weather. The entry hall smelled like coffee and cinnamon. I set my wet hand on the console table to steady myself and heard it then. Not from the living room, from the kitchen. A man's voice I did not know. Measured, quiet, professional. "There is still risk if he starts suspecting the pattern." Chloe answered him. "He won't. He still thinks the journal is about sleep." Then Marianne. "He noticed the signing authority form in July. I told you he noticed." The stranger replied, "He noticed a document. That is not the same as understanding leverage." I pulled my phone out with hands that had suddenly forgotten fine motor control. On the third try, I opened the recorder. Red dot, running. There are moments when life becomes unreal, not because the facts are confusing, but because they are too plain. My wife, my daughter, a man I had never met, discussing leverage, discussing me. I moved down the hall on the runner rug that had faded along the center seam years earlier and stopped just before the kitchen threshold where I could hear clearly without being seen. The stranger spoke again. "You already have the incident log from February to August. Marianne's observations are consistent. Chloe's time-stamped videos support executive fluctuation. With the pharmacy overlap and one more impaired decision in front of witnesses, a temporary incapacity filing becomes simple." Chloe said he won't hand over the company voluntarily. "No," the man said, "but courts dislike risk, especially if family is unified." Unified. That word almost made me step into the room right then. Instead, I stayed where I was and listened to my daughter ask, how quickly could control shift after the emergency filing? The man answered, "Within days if the judge believes his functioning is unstable and business assets are at risk." My mouth went dry. This was not about helping me recover. This was a seizure plan, not months from now, not theoretical, active, current. And then came the number. Marianne asked, "What about the trust accounts? If Richard is under review, can Chloe still move the development reserve?" The man said, "The reserve was already moved in stages. What matters now is paper continuity." My vision actually narrowed. The development reserve was company money set aside for a new Spokane distribution yard. Only 4 people knew the exact amount in that account. I was one of them. Chloe was not supposed to be. Harold laughed again in the den at some stupid answer on television, while my wife and daughter discussed how to strip my authority and hide the money trail 3 rooms away. That contrast is what still haunts me. Ordinary sound beside extraordinary rot. I edged closer and saw them at last through the reflection in the dark microwave door. Marianne stood by the sink, arms crossed tight over herself. Chloe leaned against the island in a camel coat, face pale but focused. And between them sat Daniel Voss, mid-30s, good suit, no umbrella though it was raining. The kind of posture that said he had never rushed a day in his life because rushing was for people with less control. He had been in my house for 7 months, drinking my coffee, asking me word recall questions, smiling sympathetically when I forgot where I set my reading glasses, and now he was in my mother-in-law's kitchen explaining how to have me declared legally incompetent. I nearly stepped forward then. What stopped me was not fear. It was greed. Not mine. Theirs. I realized in that moment that whatever I had heard so far was only the surface of it, and if I showed my hand too early, they would destroy evidence before I understood the full shape of the theft. So I stayed still, and because I stayed still, I heard the sentence that changed the entire map. Chloe asked, "What if the emergency filing still isn't enough? We've already moved almost 300 and he still hasn't really looked." Daniel did not answer immediately. Then he said, "If it comes to that, the policy changes the math." Silence. Then Marianne, voice tighter than before. "I don't want to talk about that." Chloe did. "He changed the beneficiary back after his accident, remember? You said he was sentimental and put mom first again. That leaves us exposed." Daniel's tone remained smooth. "Only if you panic, one step at a time. First incapacity, then asset insulation, then review the policy." Review the policy. I felt something old and animal move under my skin. I had a $2 million life insurance policy. My beneficiary had been Marianne since Chloe was 6 years old. 6 weeks after the fall on the ice, I remembered signing a routine update packet Daniel had said was just continuity paperwork because banks got strange after medical events. I had not read it carefully. God help me, I had not read it carefully. June called from the den. "Marianne, are you making more coffee or staging a coup in there?" The joke hit the room and nobody laughed. That told me enough all by itself. I backed away, silent on the runner, slipped out the front door into the rain, and sat in my truck with water dripping from my hair onto the steering wheel while my marriage finished changing shape forever. I did not drive right away. I pulled the recording back and listened to the first 30 seconds, then the next minute, then the part about the emergency incapacity filing. Their voices came through clean. Marianne, Chloe, Daniel. No ambiguity, no maybe. That is the strange mercy of betrayal done by organized people. They often document themselves better than honest people do. I drove home by muscle memory. Rain blurred Mercer Way into silver streaks, and every stoplight seemed slightly too long. People crossed intersections carrying umbrellas. A man in a bright yellow raincoat jogged past a bus stop. A delivery van cut me off near the bridge, and I barely reacted. Inside my skull, something had gone very cold and very exact. Shock is often described as numbness. That is only half true. There is also a version of shock that makes details come into brutal focus. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already built the first list. Do not confront them. Check the reserve account. Check the policy. Check every document signed after January. Find out whether Daniel Voss is even licensed to do half the things he claims. Find somebody outside the family immediately. Back up the recording in 3 places. Eat something before you pass out like an idiot. I managed only 5 of those things in the first hour. I went straight to my study, shut the door, and opened the secure banking portal for the company's development reserve. The number on the screen made me sit down so hard, the chair banged the wall. The account should have held $612,000. It held $301,844. Not empty. Worse. Drained in careful increments. 5 transfers of $40,000. 3 of $25,000. Smaller amounts threaded between them like filler. Outgoing wires routed first through a consulting entity with a bland name I did not recognize, then onward into 2 accounts that meant nothing to me until I started matching dates. My hands shook so badly I had to lay them flat on the desk to steady them. Almost $300,000. Chloe had said the number out loud in the kitchen, and now the account confirmed it. I checked the access log, multiple authorizations, my credentials used, several sign-ins time-stamped late at night from the house IP. At first, that confused me. Then I remembered something Daniel had recommended in February. For safety and convenience during recovery, Richard, let's set up mirrored access and continuity storage for your login sequence. He had helped me store sensitive credentials in Marianne's locked desk drawer in case I ever had another dizzy spell. My stomach turned. Next, the insurance portal, user history, document update, beneficiary review packet. I opened the most recent file. Primary beneficiary, Chloe Halston, not Marianne, Chloe. Secondary contingent, Marianne Halston. Changed 5 months earlier. Electronic authorization completed with my digital token. I do not remember making that change because I did not make that change. I went back further. There it was. A note in Daniel's language attached to the upload. Beneficiary alignment recommended in context of cognitive continuity and intergenerational business stability. That phrase is still one of the most obscene things I have ever read. Intergenerational business stability. He was dressing my murder in administrative wool. I called Teresa Sloan at 10:48. We had been law school friends before she escaped corporate work, built her own litigation practice, and acquired the kind of reputation that makes liars nervous and judges sit straighter. Teresa did not waste language. She did not waste sympathy either, which is why I trusted her. She answered on the second ring. You calling for fun or fire? Fire, I said. Something in my voice must have landed because hers changed instantly. Talk. I told her enough to move, not enough to dissolve into explanation. Wife lied, daughter involved, unknown consultant, money gone, incapacity plan, insurance changed, possible life risk, recorded audio. She listened without interruption. Then she said, Do not tell them you know. Email me nothing yet. Bring every device and every piece of paper you can carry. And Richard? Yes. Do not drink anything in that house tonight unless you opened it yourself. There are moments when another person's seriousness tells you how bad your own situation really is. That was one of them. Teresa's office was 20 minutes away in downtown Seattle. I copied the recording to a secure drive, printed the account statements, took screenshots of the insurance change, and left the house before Marianne texted that Harold and June were tired but okay. I typed back, glad they're stable. Let me know if you need anything. The lie came easier than I expected. Maybe because they had already shown me what honesty was worth to them. Teresa read the statements first. Then she listened to the recording with her elbows on the desk and her jaw getting tighter with every minute. When it ended, she removed one earbud and said, That is not concern. That is coordinated civil theft with criminal ambition. I remember asking, How bad? She slid the statements toward herself again, Bad enough that if you mishandle the next 48 hours, they will destroy paper, move funds again, and call you unstable before sunset. Then she called somebody from memory. Not a paralegal, not a junior associate, a private investigator named Victor Ames, who, as she put it, had two useful qualities. He was patient, and he hated elegant sociopaths. Victor arrived 30 minutes later in a rain-dark coat smelling faintly of cigarettes and cedar. Ex-cop, late 50s. Eyes like a man who had spent years learning which version of a story people wanted to be true before they admitted the uglier one. Teresa played the recording once for him without commentary. He listened, nodded, and said, "The consultant's the hinge." "What do you mean?" I asked. He normalized access. He translated family feeling into paper. He gave them professional cover. Victor tapped the desk. "You prove he's fraudulent or conflicted. The rest gets easier to break," Teresa added. "And if he has prior victims, we go from domestic mess to pattern." They worked the room harder than I could. What dates corresponded to the transfers? What did Daniel claim to be licensed in? Who besides family knew about my fall? Was there any board tension already? Had I signed anything since January without full review? Did Marianne know about the money, or only the supposed decline? Was Chloe in debt? Had my behavior actually changed in ways a court might misread? That last question stung because it was real. Yes, I had been more irritable after the accident. Yes, I had forgotten things. Yes, I had let Daniel into rooms he never should have entered. A lie built around a small truth can survive much longer than a lie made of nothing. By 1 in the afternoon, Teresa had drafted 3 immediate steps. First, freeze what I could freeze quietly through internal authority and emergency banking review. Second, revoke all digital credentials and require in-person validation for any new company transfer without explaining why. Third, go home and act normal. I hated the third step most. Victor said men always hate that one most. "I'm not an actor." "No," he said. "You're the Mark who just woke up. Same problem either way." Before I left, Teresa asked one more question. "Richard, did they actually mention harming you, or only the policy?" "Only the policy." She held my gaze a second too long. That's enough to assume possibility. I did not sleep much that night. Marianne came home around 6, kissed my cheek, warmed soup, told me June was calmer, and asked whether I had remembered to email the Yakima numbers to Marcus in accounting. Marcus, accounting. Daniel had started inserting himself even into the names in our house. Chloe called at 7:30, sounding tired and affectionate. "Love you, Dad. Sorry this morning got chaotic." I said I loved her too and wondered whether she had rehearsed the softness or simply no longer needed to. Victor was right about Daniel being the hinge. Within 36 hours, he had enough on Daniel Voss to turn my anger into something more disciplined. Daniel was not a neurologist, not a physician, not a clinical psychologist, not a licensed therapist in Washington. He held a master's in organizational coaching from a private program in Arizona, a collection of certifications vague enough to sound expensive, and a business history that drifted between consultancy shells every 2 or 3 years like a man changing jackets when the weather around his reputation turned. His current entity, Voss Advisory Strategies, had no real employees and an office address that traced back to a shared executive suite. There were no malpractice claims because there was no real clinical practice to malpractice. There were, however, 2 civil complaints in other states. Not headline material, not enough to put him away by themselves, but enough to show a pattern. One involved an elderly widower in Colorado who claimed Daniel inserted himself into wellness transition planning after a minor stroke and then somehow ended up with access to family accounts and healthcare proxies before the case settled quietly. The other involved a startup founder in Phoenix whose ex-wife alleged that Daniel blurred the line between executive coaching and incapacity documentation in the middle of a divorce battle. Neither case had finished cleanly. Both disappeared behind private settlements, and Daniel, unsurprisingly, had moved on. Victor also found something else by the end of day 2. Daniel was married, not separated, not divorced, married. His wife's name was Elise Voss, school counselor, age 34, 1 child, a little boy named Parker who had just turned 4. They lived in a modern townhouse in Kirkland, and judging from neighborhood photos Victor pulled, Daniel spent enough time there to keep up appearances without actually living honestly inside that life. That information mattered for 2 reasons. First, it meant Daniel was practicing his charm across parallel households. Second, it gave me a possible pressure point later if I needed somebody whose world might split apart at exactly the right moment. Meanwhile, Teresa handled the legal side of what could be frozen without noise. The Spokane Reserve was placed under temporary fraud review through internal banking channels because I could show suspicious movement inconsistent with authorized development schedules. That did not get my money back immediately, but it slowed further transfer capacity. We also locked down fresh digital authorizations. and quietly pulled board archives for any forms Chloe might have accessed under continuity planning. There were more than I expected. She had requested executive medical accommodation language from HR in March. She had asked for articles about emergency succession in closely held companies in May. She had scheduled a private lunch in July with one of our older board members, who later told Victor she was simply concerned about my father's resilience after the accident. Concern again. Always concern. By Thursday, Victor had enough surveillance to change the emotional geometry of the betrayal. He followed Daniel from one of his so-called cognitive support sessions at my house to a coffee shop in Bellevue Square, where Chloe met him 20 minutes later. Not work posture, not family-friend posture, intimate. Their knees touched under the table. She leaned across for his phone. He kissed the inside of her wrist when nobody was looking except Victor and the camera hidden in the passenger seat across the lot. An hour later, they left in separate cars and met again near a hotel bar in downtown Seattle, where Daniel booked a room under initials, not his own name, which is a habit of guilty men who think abbreviations are strategy. Victor photographed all of it. I looked at the images in Teresa's office and felt strangely calm. Maybe because proof simplifies pain. Until then, one terrible possibility had still been moving through my mind. What if Marianne and Daniel were having the affair and Chloe was only the ambitious accomplice? The truth was uglier in a more layered way. Daniel was sleeping with Chloe, but he was also feeding Marianne something more useful than sex. Attention. He sat too close during sessions, texted her privately about my fatigue patterns, stayed after I went upstairs to take calls, asked her how she was holding up, told her she had carried too much for too long. Let her believe that among all the people orbiting my business, he was the first one truly seeing her. That is how you keep a lonely wife cooperative while you use her daughter to steal the husband's future. By then, Teresa had pieced together more of the money trail. A home equity line on our lake house had been opened 6 months earlier. Amount approved, $180,000. Electronic consent, mine. It was not mine. The HELOC funds moved out in 2 waves. One into the same bland consulting entity attached to Daniel. Another into a trust drafting service that turned out to be a shell with no substantive office and no attorney on payroll. 3 forged signatures later, the paper trail made its intention obvious. They were not just taking cash. They were building the skeleton for legal control. By Friday afternoon, Teresa put the totals on a yellow legal pad in front of me. Spokane Reserve Diversion, $310,156 moved or in motion. Lake House line of credit exposure, $180,000. Personal brokerage transfers, $67,000. Miscellaneous account bleed over 7 months, just under $41,000. Total direct exposure, roughly $598,000. I stared at that number so long, Teresa finally pulled the pad back. You can hate the total later, she said. Right now, you need to understand what it bought. What? Time, documents, confidence, and a reason for them not to stop. That weekend, I went through my own house like a guest, learning where the rot had spread. There was a sleep journal on Marianne's nightstand. Not just a journal, a curated record. Date, hours slept, mood on waking, names forgotten, objects misplaced, moments of irritation, driving concerns, repeated questions. Some entries were real, many were not. One Tuesday in April, she claimed I had asked 3 times whether Chloe was still living in Fremont, even though Chloe had not lived there in 6 years. That never happened. Another entry said I became disoriented after forgetting the alarm code and called our neighbor by the wrong name. Also false. Mixed between those lies were smaller truths. I did misplace the garage opener once. I did forget one dinner reservation. I did call a vendor by his predecessor's name. That blend is what made the journal so effective. It read credible because it was marbled with enough ordinary human error to carry the invented parts. In a locked file drawer in Chloe's old bedroom, I found printed forms Daniel had left from earlier sessions. Cognitive consistency checklists, decision fatigue scales, executive mood trend mapping, all of it dressed in clean design and calm font choices that made nonsense look structured. On one page, Daniel had written in the margin, Marianne's observations remain essential to pattern credibility. Pattern credibility. My marriage in 4 syllables. I slept with the bedroom door locked for the first time in 31 years on Sunday night. I hated myself for doing it. I would later hate myself more for not doing it sooner. Predators who operate through narrative do not like abrupt changes in routine. The minute you stop playing your assigned role, they begin to test for movement. By Monday, Chloe was texting more than usual. How was your morning? Did you remember lunch with Greg? Daniel says stress spikes can mimic recovery setbacks. Maybe skip driving after dark this week? Soft, attentive, allergic to accusation. Marianne became gentler in a way that now felt terrifying. She offered to make tea during work calls. asked whether I had taken my supplements, suggested Daniel come by less often because maybe too much focus on recovery makes you feel monitored. That last one was almost elegant. Reduce the visible threat just when you start feeling it. I answered carefully. Maybe next week. Of course, she said. Whatever makes you comfortable. Comfortable, as if I had not already heard them discussing emergency incapacity thresholds between coffee mugs in her parents' kitchen. Victor, meanwhile, kept building. He pulled hotel records, cross-checked Chloe's credit card statements through public traces and what Teresa could access lawfully with my help. Found that Daniel had billed Marianne for 12 cognitive stabilization consultations while spending at least 4 of those windows in hotel rooms with Chloe. He also identified a neurologist whose name appeared in the draft incapacity packet. Dr. Helen Rowe, actual physician, actual practice, no relationship to Daniel. Teresa contacted her carefully through a colleague. By Tuesday evening, we knew another crucial truth. Dr. Rowe had seen me once after the fall. 1 visit, 42 minutes, normal recovery, no evidence of progressive impairment, no recommendation for guardianship, no concern about executive capacity. Yet someone had built documents around her name suggesting ongoing review and escalating concern. Not her, not her office, which meant Daniel's plan was even sloppier beneath the polish than I had first imagined. He was not just manipulating family, he was fabricating medical shadow around a real doctor's identity. Then came the first physical attempt, or maybe I should call it the first attempt I can prove. Our board held an annual donor dinner each fall for the vocational grant program we funded through the company. Tuesday night was the reception at a hotel in Tacoma. Marianne insisted I go because public normalcy, she said, mattered after such a stressful year. Chloe said she would meet friends afterward and offered to stop by the reception first. Daniel was not invited and, as far as I knew, absent. Everything about that evening looked ordinary. Round tables, bad Pinot Noir, regional suppliers pretending charity and networking were separate, a keynote speech about trade apprenticeships, the sort of civic event where you shake too many hands and smile at people whose names you do not fully recover until you are back in the car. I drank 1 glass of wine during dinner and switched to sparkling water after that because Teresa had already drilled a rule into me. Open it yourself or do not consume it. So when Marianne brought me a whiskey after the keynote, I nearly refused. Then I saw the concern on her face and did something very stupid. I accepted it because part of me still wanted one corner of my old life to be real. I watched the bartender pour it. I watched the glass change hands. What I did not watch was Chloe step behind me while I was buttonholed by a city councilman and touch the rim with a dropper from her clutch. Victor saw that later on, hotel surveillance after we knew what to look for. I did not see it then. I only tasted the whiskey, found nothing strange, and finished half of it over 20 minutes while talking to our Spokane site manager about freight insurance. At 9:15, the room tilted. Not dramatically, just enough. I lost a word mid-sentence and could not find it. Then another. The light seemed louder, the carpet pattern too active, my right hand tingled. I set the glass down and tried to stand. Chloe was next to me instantly. "Dad?" Her voice carried. People turned. Marianne was there a second later, face white. "Richard, look at me." I heard somebody say, "Is he okay?" Then Chloe, not too loud but loud enough, "This is what happened in March." That line hit me even through the wave of fog moving behind my eyes. This is what happened in March. Not a worried question, a narrative marker. I do not remember every minute cleanly after that. I remember sitting instead of falling because some part of me still refused spectacle. I remember paramedics asking whether I had taken any new medications. I remember Marianne answering too quickly that I had been exhausted and skipping meals. I remember Chloe crying on cue in the ambulance bay. And I remember the toxicology nurse in the ER looking mildly puzzled the next morning when she asked why I had high levels of zolpidem in my system when my chart showed no current prescription. Zolpidem. Ambien. I had not taken a sleeping pill in years. I lied to the hospital. I said maybe I had accidentally taken an old tablet from the travel kit in my shaving bag. Why lie? Because Teresa had warned me this exact situation might come. If they think you know, they change method. If the police come too early without the larger frame, Chloe and Marianne say it was medication confusion. Daniel says post-concussion judgment fluctuates, and suddenly the man with sedative in his blood is me. So I smiled weakly, thanked the doctor, and played confused survivor while adding one more stone to the pile I would eventually drop on all of them. Victor met me in the parking garage after discharge. He had already pulled the video. Chloe, one hand on my shoulder, the other sliding something along the glass rim, while Marianne turned away to greet a donor. Tiny movement, perfect angle, court quality. He showed me a still frame on his phone and said, "Your daughter just upgraded this from theft to attempted incapacitation." Did Marianne know? He did not answer right away. Maybe, he said finally, but that girl knew exactly what she was doing. That drive home was one of the darkest of my life. Not because I thought I might die, because I had to decide whether I still had a daughter or merely a person who knew where I kept childhood photographs while she tried to drug me into incompetence in front of witnesses. When I walked through the front door, Marianne stood from the couch and rushed toward me. Thank God. Chloe rose more slowly, eyes bright with carefully managed tears. Dad, you scared us. I hugged neither of them. I said I was tired. And from the way both of them studied my face, I knew the performance on all sides had entered a new phase. If betrayal is the first wound, pretending afterward is the infection. Every dinner became theater. Marianne asking whether I wanted herbal tea instead of coffee. Chloe texting that she loved me thanking them for concern while recording everything I could without turning my own house into a circus of obvious traps. The sedative incident sharpened Teresa's timetable. We were building towards civil destruction, she said Wednesday morning in her office. Now we assume willingness to induce medical crisis. That changes how much patience I'm willing to admire in you. Victor agreed, but urgency did not mean recklessness. The law still needed structure, so we kept collecting. The next breakthrough came from paper most people would have shredded unread. Chloe had printed a draft petition through a family services portal Daniel used in prior cases. Victor recovered a deleted PDF from temporary files on our home desktop because neither Marianne nor Chloe understood that deleting a document and removing its trace are not the same thing. The title sat at the top in cold black letters: Emergency Petition for Temporary Conservatorship and Asset Protection. Petitioner, Marianne Halston. Proposed Emergency Fiduciary Support, Chloe Halston. Grounds: recent cognitive decline following head trauma, repeated disorientation, medication mismanagement, executive instability, potential danger to business continuity, impaired financial judgment. Attached exhibits referenced: spousal observation journal, video evidence of executive impairment, consultant assessment summary by Daniel Voss, insurance continuity recommendations, temporary signature authority realignment, board witness statement. Board witness statement. I sat with that one. Someone from my company had already been prepared to testify. Victor found out who by lunch. Ed Lawson, 71, semi-retired, on our board for 12 years. Kind man. Not sharp enough to smell poison when it came in the shape of paternal concern. Chloe had met him twice privately over the summer and told him she was worried about my recovery. Daniel joined the second lunch as a family advisor. They asked Ed whether he had noticed I seemed more impatient in meetings, whether I repeated myself sometimes, whether continuity planning might be prudent if something sudden happened. Ed, trying to be helpful, had said of course I had seemed stressed, and yes, I had repeated one shipping anecdote at a board retreat in June. That sentence was then placed into a draft statement as evidence of functional repetition and executive decline. When Victor showed him the wording, Ed nearly got sick in his own kitchen. He called me himself that afternoon. Richard, I am so sorry. It's not your fault. It damn well feels like it. He testified later with much more spine than they expected. That mattered. By Thursday evening, Victor also had Daniel's hotel footage, restaurant photos, expense timelines, and something I had not anticipated. Daniel had been telling Chloe they were building a future together. But he had also been telling Elise, his wife, that an unstable executive client's family had attached to him emotionally, and he was navigating boundary complications for professional reasons. He used that story to explain late nights, hidden phones, and inconsistent cash flow. He was running 3 women inside 3 different versions of himself. Chloe believed Daniel loved her and would marry her once control of my company and assets stabilized. Marianne believed Daniel respected and perhaps quietly cherished her as the only person holding our family together. Elise believed Daniel was a burdened professional navigating messy clients while still trying to be a good husband. He was, in fact, a parasite with a pressed collar. The more we learned, the more one ugly truth became clear. Marianne had crossed moral lines willingly. She lied, she kept the journal, she joined the incapacity plan, she helped move paper, but she had not designed the core architecture. Chloe and Daniel had. That distinction did not absolve Marianne. It did, however, matter for the final blow. I realized that to fully destroy the alliance, I needed Marianne to understand in real time that she had not been Daniel's chosen intimate or even his true partner. She had been operational cover, a wife-shaped shield. And to make that land, I needed one more piece: Elise. Victor approached her first through caution, not accusation. He did not tell her everything. He told her enough. Her husband, a client family, large money movement, possible fraud, possible danger. Elise agreed to meet Teresa and Victor in a neutral conference room on Friday evening. I was not there. Teresa thought my presence would either look manipulative or make the conversation explode too early. Instead, Victor recorded the meeting for summary and Teresa walked Elise through photographs, bank links, hotel evidence, and the incapacity petition references. Elise did not cry at first. She asked very practical questions. How long? How much money? Was my child around him? Did he use our home address for any paperwork? Did he ever mention the name Halston in front of me, and if so, what version? That last question told Teresa everything she needed to know about how deeply Elise already distrusted the lies she had been living beside. The answer was yes. He had mentioned me once, dismissively. Said I was a strong legacy personality with post-traumatic rigidity and compliance issues. Compliance issues. Imagine hearing your husband describe another man that way and still having to ask whether he is lying to you professionally, personally, or both. By the end of the meeting, Elise had agreed to cooperate if necessary. Not out of loyalty to me, out of fury at Daniel. Good. Fury is clean. That weekend I made one mistake, or maybe it was not a mistake. Maybe it was the last reflex of a dying life. Saturday morning, Marianne found me on the back patio in rain gear, checking the grill-covered tie-downs after wind had kicked up overnight. She stood there in slippers and a cardigan, arms wrapped around herself, and said, "I miss you." Just like that. No speech, no manipulation visible, no mention of recovery or Daniel or the company. I turned and looked at her. 31 years of anniversaries and road trips and mortgages and funerals and stupid inside jokes stood between us in that rain-soft backyard. For one thin, stupid second, I wanted the entire recording from her parents' kitchen to be fake. I wanted there to be some insane explanation. I wanted to be the man whose wife had made a terrible mistake, not the man whose wife had participated in drafting his legal erasure. Then she said the next thing. Maybe if you let Daniel help a little longer, we can all stop living like this. And the second passed. That is the nature of betrayal. It keeps offering you counterfeit tenderness to see whether you still prefer comfort over clarity. By Sunday, Teresa had the final summary memo in place: sedation on video, fraud trajectory, forged insurance change, shell entities, HELOC, conservatorship draft, medical misrepresentation, affair, potential civil and criminal exposure. "What's the endgame?" Victor asked. I answered before Teresa could. "Dinner." Both of them looked at me. "They built the story at family tables," I said. "They used domestic space to make power feel normal. I want it to end there." Teresa did not smile, but something in her eyes said I had finally stopped being only the victim. The plan I built was not dramatic on the surface. That was the point. Predators who pride themselves on control are easiest to break when they believe the scene belongs to them. So I gave them a scene they thought they wanted. Monday morning, I told Marianne over coffee that the hospital incident frightened me more than I had admitted. I said maybe she and Chloe had been right all along, that I needed to think seriously about stepping back before stress made everything worse. She hid the first flash of triumph quickly. Not fast enough. "Richard," she said softly, "nobody wants to take anything from you." Lie. But maybe some temporary support would give everybody room to breathe. I nodded like a tired man at the edge of surrender. By noon, Chloe had texted a message that was almost giddy in its caution. "Proud of you for being open, Dad. That takes strength. Maybe we can all sit down this week with Daniel and talk through next steps calmly." Next steps. Exactly what I wanted them thinking. I answered, "Let's do dinner Thursday at the house. Family only. If we're going to discuss the future, I want privacy." Chloe answered in under 30 seconds. "Of course. Love you." Daniel came through Marianne. "He says if you want, he can bring a simplified transition packet," she told me Tuesday evening. "Good," I said. "Tell him to." The packet was real bait. If Daniel came believing I would sign something, he would arrive in a winner's frame of mind. Winners talk too much, especially false ones. Meanwhile, Teresa and Victor finalized the trap in layers. Layer 1, documentation already secured off-site. No matter what happened Thursday, the financial and civil evidence would survive. Layer 2, hidden audio and video in the dining room, study, and kitchen. Layer 3, 2 plainclothes officers staged nearby with Detective Anna Mercer from King County Financial Crimes coordinating from a parked vehicle half a block away. Layer 4, Elise Voss and her son Parker on standby, not at the house initially. They would only come if the dinner reached the moment Teresa predicted it would reach. The moment when Daniel relaxed enough under pressure to reveal whom he really expected to walk out with. Layer 5, a doctor. Not because I needed saving, because I needed legitimacy. Dr. Helen Rowe, the neurologist whose name Daniel had been using as a ghost witness, agreed to be available remotely that night. She also prepared a signed statement confirming she had never recommended guardianship, conservatorship, executive limitation, or any similar intervention. If Daniel tried to hide behind medical jargon, Teresa wanted the actual physician ready to cut him apart. On Wednesday, Victor found one more thing so vile it hardened my resolve beyond anything emotion had managed. Daniel and Chloe had been discussing an alternative plan in text after the donor dinner drugging failed to create public collapse severe enough for emergency filing. Not murder in blunt language. Worse. Staged deterioration. The messages suggested adjusting my antihypertensive medication to create dizziness, filming me during one of those episodes, and then having Marianne discover me trying to drive or sign freight authorizations while clearly impaired. One message from Chloe read, "If Thursday doesn't get him to sign voluntarily, we use a fall. People understand falls after head injuries." Daniel answered, "Falls are messy. Better to let him create one. Confused men do half the work for you." There are sentences you read once and never again because rereading feels like letting the filth touch you twice. That was one. I wanted Chloe arrested before Thursday. Teresa said no, because then Daniel goes to ground, Marianne goes defensive, and half the story becomes impossible to prove the way it deserves to be proved. The way it deserves to be proved. She was right. Still, I barely slept Wednesday night. Not from fear, from anticipation. Revenge has a pulse when it gets close enough. Thursday morning, I did something theatrical and private that nobody else ever saw. I went into the study, opened the safe, removed the old silver fountain pen my father gave me the day I signed the first Halston Freight Incorporation papers, and set it on the desk beside the fake transition packet Teresa had printed. Why? Because symbols matter when you are taking a life back. They expected me to sign away authority with a cheap executive forms pen Daniel carried in his leather folder. I wanted my father's pen in the room when I broke them. That afternoon I cooked. Not because I was relaxed, because rituals steady the hand. Short ribs in red wine, garlic mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, a salad Marianne always liked with pears and blue cheese, warm bread from the bakery she loved near Madison Park. If this was going to be the last family dinner we ever ate as a family, I wanted the table to look like history before it became evidence. Marianne came into the kitchen around 4 and watched me reduce sauce. "This is a lot for a paperwork conversation," she said. I shrugged. If I'm going to talk about giving up pieces of my life, I'd rather not do it over takeout. Her eyes softened at that. Real pain there. Real tenderness too, maybe. That is another ugly truth. Villains in family stories are rarely villainous every second. If they were, leaving them or exposing them would be easy. Sometimes they look almost like the people you loved. That is why grief does not wait until after justice. It starts while the crime is still standing in the same kitchen. Chloe arrived at 6:20, wearing black slacks, a cream blouse, and the face of a woman rehearsing restraint over excitement. She kissed my cheek, told me the house smelled amazing, and asked whether I was sure I wanted to exhaust myself cooking. Yes, I said. I wanted tonight to matter. That seemed to please her. Daniel arrived exactly on time, dark charcoal suit, open collar, leather portfolio in hand. Smile calibrated to the millimeter. He shook my hand warmly. "Richard, thank you for inviting me." I looked at him and thought, you mistake invitation for permission. Aloud I said, "You've been involved in this family for months. It felt strange not to include you." He took that as intended, a concession, an opening, a man finally accepting the inevitable. Good. That was the first lie I fed him that night. It would not be the last. There was one meeting during the legal build-up that changed the way I understood my own near miss. Dr. Helen Rowe invited Teresa and me to her office in person the week after the donor dinner sedative incident, because she said she wanted to be very precise before putting anything stronger in writing. Her practice sat on the 8th floor of a medical building overlooking gray water and ferry traffic. The waiting room smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Abstract art no patient had ever truly looked at, hung on the walls in restrained colors, meant to suggest competence without imagination. She shook my hand, read the file Teresa brought, listened to the recording from the Whitaker kitchen, reviewed the fake packet language Daniel had attached to her name, and then sat back in her chair, looking more offended than surprised. "That man," she said, "has learned just enough neurological vocabulary to become dangerous to lay people." I asked the question that had been chewing me alive for months. "Did I ever give anyone a reason to believe I couldn't handle the company?" She answered without hesitation. "No. Not kind, not softened, not wrapped in caveats. No." She explained the scan, the typical recovery pattern, the kind of mild post-concussive symptoms I had shown. The fact that transient word-finding issues under fatigue do not equal decline. The fact that ordinary stress lapses are routinely overinterpreted by frightened families and opportunistic consultants. Then she said something more useful than all the tests. "Your real vulnerability was not neurological," she said. "It was relational. You were inside a household that turned observation into prosecution." That line hit me harder than the medical clearance, because it was exact. Observation into prosecution. She looked at me over folded hands and added, I'm going to say something blunt, because men like you often need bluntness more than reassurance. You did not almost lose your autonomy because you hit your head. You almost lost it because a minor injury gave dishonest people a respectable theme. A respectable theme. I thought about that phrase for days. People rarely seize a life by saying, "I want your money and your name and your future." They seize it by choosing a theme the world already considers understandable. Concern after injury, support after a scare, temporary help while you recover, respectable theme. By the time Teresa and I left the building, the case had become clearer to both of us. We were not just defending me from a family betrayal. We were defending the principle that a person's ordinary imperfection cannot be harvested into legal control by whoever stands nearest with the most polished language. That meeting also helped with the part of me still trying to bargain backward. What if I had rested more in January? What if I had refused Daniel earlier? What if I had read every continuity form? What if I had told Marianne to stop tracking me? What if I had spent more evenings at home the year before? Useful questions in self-improvement, poisonous questions in a prosecution. Dr. Rowe shut most of them down in 20 minutes. Could I have been more careful? Sure. Did my carelessness authorize fraud, poisoning, forged signatures, and a staged incapacity plot? No. Again, no. By the time we reached the elevator, I felt something that had been missing since Mercer Island. Not peace. Something harder and more functional. Moral footing. That matters in revenge stories more than readers realize. If the avenger is not standing on firm internal ground, he becomes just another man with evidence and adrenaline. I did not want adrenaline at the dinner. I wanted footing. I wanted to look at Daniel Voss while he still believed he understood my mind better than I did, and know with medical, legal, and moral precision that I was the sane one in the room. That certainty changes your face. People like him can smell uncertainty instantly. The absence of it throws off their timing. And yes, if I am honest, I also wanted one other thing after meeting Dr. Rowe. I wanted Daniel publicly stripped of the false clinical mystique he had been hiding inside. Men like him do not merely steal money, they steal seriousness. They borrow gravity from real doctors, real trauma, real recovery, and real fear. They drape themselves in it and sell themselves back to families as necessary. I wanted that costume burned off him inch by inch, not metaphorically, in full view. That is why, during the dinner, I saved Dr. Rowe for the precise moment when Daniel still thought he could recover by returning to language. He believed language was his safe house. She helped me turn it into his trap. The dining room looked better than it ever had during honest years. Candles, low lights, rain against the windows. The heavy walnut table set with our wedding china, which Marianne only brought out for holidays and fundraisers she wanted to impress. Daniel noticed everything, because men like him always do. "Beautiful room," he said as he sat down. "You've built an extraordinary life here." Built, not the word he thought it was. Marianne sat to my right, Chloe to my left. Daniel beside Chloe at the far side, his portfolio resting by his chair like a surgeon's bag. I took the head of the table. My father's fountain pen was inside my jacket pocket. The hidden microphone was clipped beneath the underside of the table. 3 cameras watched from ordinary-seeming places, no guest ever questions, in a familiar home. I carved the meat, passed plates, poured wine, even toasted us once, because the more normal I made the first act, the more violent the second would feel. "To family," I said. Marianne echoed it. Chloe echoed it. Daniel did too, though his eyes stayed on me over the rim of his glass, as if measuring distance to surrender. We ate for almost 20 minutes before I touched the topic they had come for. I asked Chloe about work first. She had moved from agency marketing into brand consulting the year before, and spoke fluently about launches, positioning, and client fatigue. I listened, nodded, admired how normal she could sound while building legal scaffolding for my removal. Then I asked Marianne about the Arts Board Gala. Then Daniel about his practice. That made him very comfortable. He loved talking about his work because his work, properly narrated, made him sound like compassion wrapped in strategy. He said families often struggle after a health event because roles become unclear. He said executives resist support because identity is tied to output. He said temporary structure prevents long-term damage. Temporary structure. He had phrases for everything. By the time dessert plates were cleared and coffee served, he believed the room belonged to him. So I let my shoulders lower, let some weariness into my voice, touched my forehead once as if tired. Then I said the line Chloe had been waiting months to hear. "I think maybe I've been fighting reality longer than I should." Silence. Perfect silence. I watched it move across their faces. Marianne first. Relief so immediate it looked like pain. Chloe next. A bright hunger carefully masked as tenderness. Daniel last. Not relief. Assessment. The small inward click of a man hearing a door unlock. Marianne reached for my hand. "Richard, that's not defeat. No, it was bait." Chloe leaned forward. We're not trying to take anything from you, Dad. We're trying to protect you from having to carry all of it alone. Daniel rested his forearms on the table, voice low and warm. Agency can take many forms, Richard. Sometimes the strongest decision is to create support before stress creates crisis. I nodded slowly. That's what the packet is, isn't it? Daniel tapped the portfolio lightly. A simplified framework, yes. Temporary authority support, medical continuity planning, asset safeguards. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic. A million ruined men could sit at the feet of that phrase. I asked, would signing it tonight change company control immediately? Daniel exchanged the briefest glance with Chloe. She answered first. Not control exactly, just protection. Protection for who? Marianne said, for all of us. There was the first crack. Not because the answer was false, because it was collective. All of us. I poured more coffee and leaned back. I spent most of this week trying to be honest with myself, I said. I thought about the fall last winter, the headaches, the donor dinner, the way I lose words sometimes. I let that sit. Then I thought about what it would mean if I really wasn't seeing clearly. Daniel nodded with expensive sadness. That kind of humility is rare. No, not humility. Setup. I folded my napkin carefully and asked, if I haven't been seeing clearly, then help me understand the reserve account. Nobody moved. Even the rain seemed to pull back from the windows. Chloe's face changed first, though only by a fraction. Daniel did not blink. Marianne frowned slightly. What reserve account? She asked. The Spokane Development Reserve, I said. The one that lost a little over $300,000 in 7 careful transfers. Chloe found her voice before either of the others. Dad, maybe this isn't the right way to... No, I said softly. This is exactly the right way. Marianne stared at me. Richard, what are you talking about? I reached beneath the table and set a folder in front of me. Inside were the printed transfer logs Teresa had prepared with color tabs, not theatrical, legible. I slid the first sheet toward Marianne. She looked down. I watched her read the total once. Then again, this must be wrong. It isn't. Daniel leaned in slightly. Financial irregularities can look alarming when someone is under strain. Stop, I said. Not loud, just final. He stopped. That was useful. I turned to Chloe. Would you like to explain why my credentials were used from this house at 1 a.m, 4 separate times? She stared at the paper without touching it. Dad, you're tired. You've had a terrible week. You don't need to do this in an adversarial way. Adversarial. Her favorite tactic was always to reclassify my reaction instead of answering the fact. I set another sheet down. Insurance beneficiary change. Primary, Chloe Halston. Marianne made a sound then, not a word. A sound. She snatched the page. What is this? I answered her, not Chloe. This is the $2 million policy someone moved out of your name 5 months ago with my digital authorization. My authorization was forged. Marianne looked from the paper to Chloe. No. Daniel opened his mouth. I cut him off again. If you interrupt me one more time in my house, you will regret how this evening ends. That landed. He sat back. Marianne whispered, Chloe? Chloe's eyes filled, which would have moved me once. We were trying to make things simpler if something happened. If something happened, I repeated. Interesting phrase. Marianne looked at Daniel now. What policy review? He kept his face calm. Marianne, we discussed continuity in broad terms. In broad terms? I smiled without warmth. Would you like to hear the narrow terms? I took out my phone, opened the audio file, set it in the center of the table, pressed play. My wife's voice filled the room, the journal, the medication history, 2 more observed incidents, emergency temporary control. Chloe froze. Daniel's jaw hardened. Marianne's hand began to shake against the china. Then came Chloe's voice. What if the emergency filing still isn't enough? We've already moved almost 300. I let the recording run just long enough for the line about the policy. Then I stopped it. Nobody spoke. Finally, Marianne whispered, You were there. Yes. Her face went white in stages. Not all at once, in waves. I think that is how certain truths kill illusions. Not with one blow, with serial collapses. You followed us? Chloe said. No, I answered. I listened to my instincts because the 2 of you were lying badly. Daniel tried once more for authority. Richard, even if that conversation sounded harsh outside context, the core issue remains your functional volatility. I laughed. That laugh changed the room more than anything else had so far, because it was not confused, not wounded, not unstable. It was the laugh of a man who finally understood the full poverty of the script being used on him. Functional volatility, I repeated. You should say that again when the real neurologist hears the recording. Daniel went still. Good. Now he knew the medical ghost he had been wearing had a pulse. Marianne did not cry immediately. That surprised me. She sat very straight, hands flat on either side of the policy paper, as if posture alone could hold reality in place. Then she asked the question that told me she still did not know the worst. Chloe, were you moving money without telling me? The fact that this was her first question mattered. Not, did you forge your father's signature? Not, what has Daniel done? Not, why have you been planning to erase him? Money first. That is how I knew some part of her had already accepted the conservatorship lie. She thought maybe the crime was greed stacked on top of protection. She still had not understood the depth of the dirt she was sitting in. Chloe looked at Daniel before answering. That tiny, instinctive glance ended whatever remained of my daughter's innocence in that room. We needed flexibility, she said. You said Dad would never let go on his own. Marianne turned sharply. I never said steal from him. You said he'd rather work himself into the ground than let any of us breathe. There it was, the old resentment, not new, not invented by Daniel, just harvested by him. I looked at Marianne. Did you know about the reserve transfers? Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No, she said finally. Not the amounts. Daniel said some temporary reallocations were necessary because if you were reviewed, the company could freeze discretionary capital. Daniel stepped in smoothly. That is essentially correct. I almost admired his discipline. Almost. I laid out the next sheet, the Lake House HELOC, then the temporary conservatorship draft, then the shell entity wiring summary. Each page landed with the same dull whisper against polished wood. Marianne's breathing got shallower. Richard, she said, I knew he was helping us prepare in case the board panicked about your health. I did not know. Helping you? I asked. The word cracked like ice. Helping you how? By teaching you to log every misplaced key as cognitive deterioration? By using my doctor's name on documents she never authorized? By moving $500,000 and calling it continuity? Chloe started crying in earnest then, which made Daniel move a hand toward her under the table. Marianne saw it. Just a touch. Just instinct. But she saw it. And because she saw it, I knew the time had come to break the next beam. I turned to her and said quietly, you should ask him why he touches her like that. Nobody breathed. Chloe's entire body stiffened. Daniel went perfectly still in the way only practiced liars can. Not flinch, not deny, first calculate. Marianne looked between them once, confused, then again, slower. Her voice dropped to something raw and small. What does that mean? I reached under my chair and pulled out the tablet Teresa had loaded for me. No flourish, no speech. I unlocked it, opened the photo folder, and turned the screen toward Marianne. There was Chloe in the Bellevue coffee shop, Daniel kissing the inside of her wrist. Next image. Chloe and Daniel leaving the downtown hotel. Next image. A restaurant booth in Kirkland, his hand high on her back, her head tilted toward him in a way daughters do not lean toward family consultants. Then the surveillance still from the parking garage after the donor dinner. Chloe behind me, dropper at the rim of my glass. Daniel's text timestamp aligned beside it from earlier that afternoon. Keep the dose low. We need fog, not an ambulance. Marianne made the strangest noise I have ever heard. Not a sob, not a scream, something torn. No, she whispered, then louder. No. Chloe reached for her. Mom, listen to me. Marianne jerked her hand away so violently the coffee cup tipped and spilled across the cloth. You said he understood me, she said to Chloe, not even looking at Daniel yet. You said he cared about me. You said he was only close to this family because he could see what your father had become. That sentence hung there like a second corpse. So that had been the arrangement. Chloe had not merely hidden her affair. She had actively fed Marianne a counterfeit emotional relationship with Daniel to keep her aligned. A daughter prostituting her own mother's loneliness for strategic cover. I would have thought that line too dramatic for fiction if I had not watched it happen across my own table. Daniel finally spoke. Marianne, whatever you're seeing right now is being staged to maximize emotional injury. Even then, even there. Still trying to narrate the room. I looked at him and said, you should save your calm voice. You'll need it later. Marianne stood abruptly, chair scraping, hands shaking now hard enough that she pressed one to the table for balance. You were sleeping with her? Daniel kept his tone low. Your daughter is emotionally attached to me. That is not the same as... Chloe turned on him then with pure panic. Don't, he ignored her. She came to rely on me during a period of family instability. There are lies so contemptuous they expose more than confession. That was one. He was already rewriting Chloe as the unstable one, already repositioning himself from lover to burdened professional, already selecting which woman to sacrifice first. Marianne saw it, not fully perhaps, but enough. You son of a bitch, she said. I had never heard my wife use that tone, not in 31 years. Daniel looked at her the way men like him look at anyone whose emotional value has just dropped beneath their operational usefulness. Cool, dismissive, annoyed. And Marianne, seeing that look, finally understood what she had been to him. Not beloved, not chosen, not rescued, managed. That was when the first real hatred entered the room. It came from her, not me. I let it, because some revenge tastes better when it blooms in the soil they planted themselves. By then the dinner had stopped being about proof and started becoming about sequence. That mattered. Evidence breaks people fastest when it rearranges the order in which they thought they occupied the story. First, I took their money narrative. Then I took their medical narrative. Then I took Marianne's illusion of specialness. What remained was Chloe's illusion that she and Daniel were still the true central alliance. That one I saved for last because it required a witness. I let the silence hold the room for nearly 20 seconds. Rain on the windows, coffee dripping from the tipped cup to the floor, Chloe crying quietly, Marianne standing rigid, Daniel watching all of us as if mentally sorting salvage from loss. Then I said, "There's one more guest coming tonight." Chloe looked up first. Fear, immediate and total. Daniel's face changed for the first time since he arrived. Not much, just a tiny loss of blood around the mouth. "Who?" Marianne asked. I did not answer her. I answered Daniel. "You tell them." He said nothing. "Tell them," I repeated. Chloe stared at him now in real alarm. "What is he talking about?" Daniel stood. Wrong move. Maybe he thought motion would reset the dynamic. Maybe he thought standing made him less like prey. I stayed seated and said calmly, "Sit down." He did not. Instead, he picked up his portfolio. "I'm leaving." "No," I said. And because Detective Mercer had been listening through the live feed for almost an hour, the front door opened before Daniel reached the dining room threshold. Not police yet. Not uniforms. Elise Voss stepped into the foyer holding the hand of a little boy in a red rain jacket. Parker, 4 years old, curly dark hair, a stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. Behind them stood Victor, expression flat. I will remember that sight longer than I remember any arrest. Not because it was the most legally important moment, because it was the moment Daniel's confidence finally lost contact with his face. He looked at Elise as if the laws of physics had been personally rearranged to insult him. Chloe looked from Elise to Parker to Daniel and then back again with the visible shock of a woman realizing the future she sold her soul for had not only been false, it had been rented to somebody else the entire time. Marianne sank back into her chair without meaning to. Elise did not raise her voice. That made the whole thing worse. She simply looked at Daniel and said, "You told me this was a client crisis." Then she looked at Chloe. "And you must be the reason my husband suddenly started caring so much about evening consultations." Chloe whispered, "No." Same word Marianne had used minutes earlier. Different wound. Same disbelief. I stood and crossed to Parker first because children should not spend even 1 extra second inside adult wreckage if someone can help it. "Hey, buddy," I said gently. "Would you like to sit in the den with Victor for a few minutes? There are cookies in there." He looked up at Elise. She nodded once. He went. When I turned back, the room had shifted again. Chloe was no longer crying like a daughter. She was staring at Daniel like an accomplice, realizing the escape car had never been reserved for her. Marianne looked almost gray. Elise stepped fully into the dining room and closed the door behind her. "Start with this," she said to Daniel. "Do they know about me, or am I the surprise?" I answered for him. "They know now." Then I held up another packet Victor had prepared. Condo lease records, school registration, joint credit card statements, photos of Daniel entering the Kirkland townhouse with groceries 2 nights after meeting Chloe at a hotel. Chloe's lips parted. No sound came out. Daniel tried once more for strategy. "Elise, this is not what it looks like." That line survives because men like him keep believing women will doubt their own eyes before doubting his script. Elise smiled without warmth. "It looks like fraud, adultery, and maybe attempted poisoning if Mr. Halston's investigator summarized correctly." Daniel turned toward me with pure hatred then. No calm, no consultant voice, no recovery language, just hatred. "You had me followed." "Yes, you involved my family." "No," I said. "You involved your family when you started billing my collapse as your retirement plan." Chloe finally found her voice. "You told me you were separated." Daniel did not look at her. "Chloe, now is not the time." Not the time. I almost admired the arrogance. She stood so fast her chair fell backward. "Not the time?" she shouted. "You said we were building something. You said once my father signed the transition we'd be free of all this." Marianne stared at her daughter. "Free of what?" she whispered. "Free of your father?" Chloe spun toward her, wrecked and furious now. "He was never going to hand me anything," she snapped. "I spent my whole life waiting for his company to matter more than me. Daniel said we could stop waiting." There it was, not all of it, but enough of the nerve. The little historical grievance inside the larger criminal scheme. That mattered too because juries and families alike always want the emotional engine, even when the financial engine is already clear. I said quietly, "How much of that plan involved me still being alive?" Nobody answered. So I set the parking garage still in front of Chloe, drop her at the glass, then I set the text, "Keep the dose low. We need fog, not an ambulance." Marianne made a choking sound. Elise closed her eyes briefly. Daniel did not move. Chloe stared at the page as if it might rewrite itself. "I didn't know it would hit that hard," she said. I looked at her. You put a drug in your father's drink at a public dinner so strangers could watch him fail. Tears ran down her face. I was trying to scare you into signing, Marianne whispered. My God. And because the dinner had finally arrived at the center of itself, I said the line that summoned the law. If either of you really cared about this family, you would stop talking and save it for the police. The front door opened again. This time uniforms came in. Detective Anna Mercer entered first with 2 officers and the kind of contained authority that makes everybody in the room understand the performance has ended. No sirens, no theatrics, just the clean mechanical sound of state power arriving where private corruption thought it was safest. She looked at me once. I nodded. That was all. Then she faced Daniel and Chloe. Daniel Voss, Chloe Halston. At this time, you are being detained pending arrest for financial fraud, identity-related forgery, conspiracy, and attempted administration of a controlled sedative. She turned slightly. Additional charges may follow based on evidence already collected. Marianne made a movement as if to stand and then stopped herself. Chloe shook her head wildly. Mom. Just that. Mom. A child's word coming out of a grown woman whose own choices had turned her back into something frightened and small. Marianne did not move toward her. That hurt to watch. It still hurts to remember. Whatever else Chloe had done, part of me still recognized the 5-year-old who used to fall asleep in the back seat with marker stains on her fingers after school art camp. Love does not evaporate on schedule just because justice arrives. That is part of the punishment, too. Anna read rights. One officer moved behind Daniel, another stepped toward Chloe. Daniel finally chose speech over silence. This is grotesque overreach based on family conflict and illegally framed context. Anna did not even look at him when she answered. The audio was consensually captured in the property owner's home. The financial documentation predates tonight. The medical misrepresentation trail predates tonight. And the surveillance from the hotel, parking garage, and shell entity accounts predates tonight. Now she looked at him. You are not in control of the vocabulary anymore. I will remember that sentence as long as I live. You are not in control of the vocabulary anymore. For a man like Daniel, that was almost a theological defeat. He turned once toward Elise. Not apology, not sorrow, calculation, still calculation, as if there might be one final narrative bridge left to cross. There are things you don't understand, he said to her. Elise laughed once, sharp and ugly. That has finally become your problem. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked smaller immediately. Not because handcuffs magically shrink people, because a great deal of power is posture, and once posture loses an audience, the body underneath it often disappoints. Chloe broke harder. When the officer touched her elbow, she made a sound I had not heard since she was little and cut her knee open on a gravel trail. Pure panic. No elegance. Dad, she said, please don't do this. That word did something terrible inside me because it carried memory on it. Not the scheming woman from my dining room. My daughter at 10 asking for 1 more minute on the dock before sunset. My daughter at 17 saying, please let me keep the car out late. My daughter at 22 hugging me after her graduation. For 1 second, every version of her lived in the same breath. Then Victor's photo flashed through my mind. The dropper, the text, the reserve account, the incapacity petition. I said the hardest true thing I have ever said. I didn't do this, Chloe. You did. She collapsed into sobbing then, not strategic, animal. The officer guided her toward the foyer. Marianne turned away. Daniel went out without looking back. Once the door closed behind them, the house became very quiet very quickly. It is astonishing how loud wicked people are even when they speak softly. Once they leave, silence arrives like weather. Elise stood by the sideboard, one hand over her mouth. Anna spoke to her gently, arranged a follow-up statement for the next morning, and let Victor walk Parker back from the den only after the cuffs and uniforms were gone from his sightline. Parker looked sleepy and confused. Daniel's son. A child as innocent as any other child in any family story until adults decide to use rooms and lies to change that. Elise thanked me once, stiffly. Not because she liked me, because truth, however brutal, had at least returned choice to her life. When she left, Marianne and I were alone in the dining room except for Anna at the far side gathering her notes. The china sat half-used. Coffee rings stained the cloth. A fork lay on the floor near Chloe's chair. All the ordinary remains of dinner sat beside the remains of my marriage. Marianne looked at me then fully for the first time since the arrests. I didn't know about the sedative, she said. Her voice was raw enough that I believed her. I also no longer cared enough for belief to save her. You knew enough. I thought he was helping. You thought he was helping himself through us. She flinched. Richard, I never wanted you hurt. I looked at the policy paper still sitting by her plate. Then you should have wanted me respected. That line ended whatever explanation she still imagined might matter. She lowered her head into her hands and began to cry in the heavy, exhausted way of somebody who has finally run out of useful lies and discovered remorse is heavier than deception. Anna asked if I wanted an officer to stay outside overnight. Yes, I said. When she left, the house felt altered down to the studs. I cleaned the table alone, not because I needed the dishes done, because motion is sometimes the only thing that keeps fury from turning stupid. At midnight, I found Marianne sitting on the floor of the dark living room with her back against the sofa, still wearing the same clothes, eyes open and ruined. "Did you ever love him?" I asked. She took too long to answer. "That was not the right thing," she whispered. What I loved was the feeling that somebody was finally taking my side. There it was, the whole ugly, cheap tragedy of it. Not grand passion, not destiny, not star-crossed anything, alignment, attention. The narcotic of being mirrored by a manipulator who studies your hunger better than your husband studies your loneliness. I nodded once. Then I went upstairs and locked the bedroom door. The criminal process began exactly where life had ended, with paperwork, statements, preservation orders, digital extractions, bank subpoenas, protective coordination around company accounts, temporary separation arrangements, emergency board briefings. I had to deliver without explaining every private humiliation in public language. Teresa handled most of the legal traffic with the sort of cold efficiency that makes panic feel vaguely embarrassed to still be in the room. Victor kept digging, and Marianne, after 2 days of near catatonic silence, asked for her own lawyer. Good. People should pay for certain forms of clarity by invoice. Chloe and Daniel were charged first on the cleanest available counts: fraud, forgery, identity crime, conspiracy, attempted unlawful administration of a sedative, financial exploitation. Broader counts took longer because prosecutors are slow when they want to stay effective. The story leaked by the second week anyway. Not the whole thing. Nothing ever leaks in the proportion you deserve. A shipping executive, possible incapacity plot, family betrayal, advisor affair, donor dinner drugging. The local business press used the phrase succession scandal. I hated that. It sounded like expensive gossip instead of the methodical attempt to erase a living man behind clinical language and family concern. The board meeting after the arrests was brutal. Not because anyone turned on me, because good people did the humane thing and tried to sound gentle. Ed Lawson looked like he might cry when he apologized in front of everyone. Our CFO kept insisting we could take time. 2 members suggested bringing in interim leadership until public perception stabilized. Public perception. I almost threw them all out. Then I realized some small bitter part of Daniel's work had succeeded. Even innocent people were now speaking to me through the fog he built. Not because they thought I was unfit, because the story of possible unfitness had entered the room, and once that story exists, it stains furniture long after the liar leaves. So I did the only thing that made sense. I gave them facts, not feelings, not pleas, the real neurologist statement, the forged documents, the stolen reserve summary, the surveillance stills, the sedative toxicology, the arrest record. When I finished, nobody asked for interim leadership again. That was one of the smaller victories. Smaller does not mean unimportant. Marianne moved into the lake house under temporary agreement while divorce counsel began circling the wreckage. She asked once through Teresa whether I would consider avoiding criminal testimony against her if she cooperated fully against Daniel and Chloe. I considered it. Then I read her original observation journal again. Page after page of invention dressed as care. No. Cooperation, yes. Immunity from consequence, no. Chloe called me from county lockup once. I did not answer. She left a voicemail. "Dad, please. Daniel made everything sound temporary. He said you would recover from the humiliation faster than we would recover from losing everything. I know how horrible that sounds. I know it. I just need you to know I wasn't trying to kill you." That line enraged Teresa more than it enraged me. As if intent is some neat little hallway she gets to choose after the body falls, she said. I saved the voicemail. Not for court, for memory. People rewrite themselves fastest after arrest. I wanted the original sound of her thinking still visible somewhere. The prosecution's best move came from Marianne. Not because she became noble, because betrayal, once redirected, often turns practical. Faced with the photographs, Daniel's marriage, the fake medical materials, and the packet language around the policy, she finally admitted something critical. In April, Daniel had told her, in Chloe's presence, that if I ever had one truly public cognitive event, a temporary protective filing could happen before I even understood what was being signed around me. Public cognitive event. When prosecutors laid that next to the donor dinner sedative footage, the story hardened from manipulation into design. They were not reacting to decline. They were manufacturing display. Victor also recovered texts between Daniel and Chloe after the hospital incident. Need a cleaner demonstration next time. He still looks too lucid on discharge. Maybe the driving angle works better if Marianne is the one who sees it. driving angle. There was the fall plan in embryo, not dramatic enough for television, plenty dramatic enough for a jury. Elise filed for divorce the same month. She sent me one short note through Teresa. I am sorry your family crossed ours this way. For what it is worth, I believe your daughter was used and your wife was studied. I also believe my husband enjoyed both. That was as close to mercy as the case ever got. When the grand jury extension cleared the broader conspiracy counts, Daniel's lawyers tried a predictable move. They offered a partial narrative: consultant overreach, blurred boundaries, misguided financial protection, family panic after a head injury, no mention of sedative intent, no mention of affair as leverage, no mention of forged medical implications. Teresa laughed when she read it. Then she slid the paper to me and said, "This is what men like him always do. They downgrade evil into poor judgment and hope the room is too tired to argue." I was not too tired, not yet. Trial began in late March, 9 months after the dinner. Long enough for all of us to become sharper and stranger. Not long enough for the damage to fade. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Or maybe I was. Daniel sat at defense table in a navy suit that tried to reconstruct authority and failed. Chloe looked smaller, hair darker, face older in the cruel way pretrial stress ages people. Marianne, testifying later under cooperation terms, wore gray and avoided my eyes. The prosecution built the case methodically. First the accident and Daniel's insertion into our lives, then the journal, then the false continuity forms, then the reserve money, then the HELOC, then the policy, then Dr. Rowe, then the hotel photographs, then the sedative. Not spectacle. Architecture. That was the right approach. Because the scam itself had been architecture. One beam does not explain a house. You show the whole frame. When I took the stand, the defense tried to cut me along familiar lines. Were you emotionally absent? Did your daughter feel overlooked? Did your wife experience years of loneliness? Were you irritable after the fall? Did you ever forget names? Did you sometimes work too much to be easy to live with? Yes, probably. Yes, of course, absolutely. Truth does not weaken when it includes your failures. In fact, it gets harder to dislodge. That is what their side misread. They assumed if I admitted imperfection, the larger structure of fraud became ambiguous. It did not. It simply made me human. Chloe testified on day 6. She cried almost immediately. Some of it was real. I think that much is fair. She said Daniel made everything sound reversible. She said she was drowning in debt from a venture capital scam and desperate to stop feeling powerless. She admitted the reserve diversions, admitted the policy change, admitted putting the sedative on the glass. When the prosecutor asked whether she knew the dose could hospitalize me, Chloe whispered yes. The whole room seemed to tighten. Then came the harder question. Did you understand that if your father were publicly perceived as impaired, you and Daniel could accelerate emergency control over his business? Another pause. Yes. Not murder, then. Maybe not in the vivid cinematic sense. Something colder. Instrumental destruction. The kind that does not need you dead right away if legally ruined will do. Daniel's testimony was exactly what I expected and still exhausting to hear. He called himself a misunderstood consultant. He said family systems after brain injury are complex. He said Marianne's journal was an observational wellness tool, not medical evidence. He said Chloe pursued him and he mishandled boundaries during a period of emotional volatility. He said the financial structures were contingency planning misinterpreted after family breakdown. He said the sedative text referred to reducing panic, not inducing incapacity. It would have been almost impressive if it were not so filthy. Then the prosecution played the dinner audio. Not the whole thing, just enough. My question about the reserve account, his functional volatility line, Chloe's admission that I would never let go on my own, Marianne's shock at the affair, Daniel's reclassification of Chloe as emotionally attached, my line about the real neurologist, then Detective Mercer's arrival. Jurors pay attention differently when arrogance hits a wall on tape. But the blow that really ended him came from language he never thought anyone would lay side by side. Dana Hargrove, the lead prosecutor, put 3 documents on a screen. 1, Daniel's Colorado settlement intake note about an elderly widower. 2, the Phoenix coaching memo. 3, my wife's observation packet and the draft conservatorship petition. Then she highlighted phrases: pattern credibility, protective delay, executive fluctuation, support before crisis, temporary authority, family unified, medical continuity, business stability, same vocabulary, different victims, not exact, similar enough to show this was not spontaneous concern improvised around my life. It was his method. Then Dr. Helen Rowe testified, calm, precise, unimpressed. She explained my actual post-concussion profile in accessible terms. She explained how mild injury recovery does not justify the language Daniel had been circulating in my name. She explained that forgetfulness under stress is not evidence of incapacity. And when the prosecutor asked whether she had ever recommended guardianship, conservatorship, or emergency authority transfer for me, she said one word: No. Clean, complete, irreversible. The defense cross-examined her hard and got nowhere. Ed Lawson testified too. So did the hotel manager. So did the toxicology nurse. So did Elise. Elise's testimony was quieter than I expected and more devastating because of it. She described Daniel's excuses. The client crisis lie, the double life, the child schedule, the nights he claimed he was helping a vulnerable family manage a damaged husband while he was actually sleeping with their daughter and building paperwork to take that husband's assets. When she stepped down, even the defense table seemed to know the room had stopped belonging to them. Marianne testified on rebuttal. I had dreaded it, not because I feared what she would say, because I feared what hearing her would do to me. She told the truth in pieces, not beautifully, not heroically. She said she felt unseen for years. She said Daniel noticed that and used it. She said she believed I had become harder and more forgetful after the fall, and that part of her wanted to believe somebody else finally knew what to do with the man I had become. She admitted creating false journal entries because Daniel told her family courts respond to patterns, not isolated moments. She admitted joining the plan to protect the company temporarily. Then she said the sentence I had been waiting for and never wanted. I told myself we were protecting him from humiliation, but what we were really protecting was our right to do this without his consent. That line mattered, not for punishment, for truth, because it named the core crime better than any statute had. Doing it without his consent. The jury took less than a day. Daniel Voss was convicted on major fraud counts, forgery-related counts, conspiracy, attempted unlawful administration of a sedative, and multiple enhancements tied to exploitation and fabricated medical influence. Chloe was convicted on fraud, conspiracy, forgery participation, and the sedative count, though with less exposure than Daniel, because the evidence showed she was both actor and instrument. Marianne avoided the heaviest criminal outcome through cooperation, but paid elsewhere. Civil liability, divorce, public shame, permanent fracture with her daughter, and the knowledge that she helped build the room even if she did not design every wall. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Daniel received 12 years. When the judge described his conduct as predatory parasitism dressed in wellness language, I felt something in my chest settle for the first time in nearly a year. Chloe received 7, with eligibility windows and treatment components, her lawyer emphasized as if vocabulary could subtract what she had done. I did not celebrate. That surprises some people when they hear the end of the story. They expect triumphant revenge to taste bright. It doesn't. It tastes accurate. That is different. After sentencing, Chloe asked through counsel whether I would read a letter. I refused at first. Then Teresa said, "Read it once, not for her, for your own future arguments with memory." So I read it. It was 8 pages. Some honest parts, some selfish parts. Some lines clearly influenced by therapy and legal advice. A few sentences from the actual child she had once been before. Ambition and resentment made her useful to a man like Daniel. The sentence I remember most said, "I kept waiting for you to finally choose me first, and when someone offered me a shortcut to that feeling, I mistook theft for justice." I folded the letter and put it away. Not because I forgave her, because she had, at last, named her own corruption without calling it care. That was something. Not enough, but something. Divorce after a crime does not feel like ordinary divorce. There is no argument over style, no mutual disappointment, no clean list of incompatibilities. There is evidence, depositions, asset recovery actions, forensic accounting, the mechanical language of dismantling a partnership that was already morally dead before the law caught up. Marianne did not contest much in the end. She knew better. The civil suits clawed back part of the reserve, froze the condo-linked accounts Daniel had touched, and helped unwind enough of the lake house exposure that I did not lose the property. Not all the money returned. That is another truth worth stating plainly. Justice is not restoration, not fully. Some money vanishes into fees, timing, shell structures, and the simple fact that thieves spend faster than courts move. But enough came back. Enough to finish the Spokane yard 2 years later. Enough to keep the company from becoming another casualty of the family that tried to seize it. The harder recovery was not financial, it was interpretive. After something like this, every memory becomes a contested territory. The beach trip where Marianne held my hand under a blanket by the fire pit. Was she already lonely then or simply tired? Chloe at 23 asking if I could help with a lease deposit. Was that dependency, love, testing? The first time Daniel came over with his notebook and soft voice, why did I not throw him out? People say you should not rewrite your whole life because of one betrayal. They are right in theory. In practice, the betrayal rewrites plenty for you, and your job is to stop it from taking everything. For months, I woke at 4 or 5 with a list of old scenes running through my mind like evidence reels. The hospital discharge after my fall. The way Marianne said, Maybe just let Daniel help for a while. Chloe laughing about me forgetting names. The donor dinner. The coffee in the Whitaker's kitchen. The policy update I signed too quickly. I started therapy because Teresa threatened to stop calling me emotionally literate if I did not. My therapist, a blunt woman named Rebecca Lynn, gave me the most useful distinction anyone offered all year. Stop asking when the lie began, she said. Ask when the people involved decided the lie mattered more than your consent. That changed something, because it pulled me away from impossible archaeology and toward the actual crime. Not every bad marriage ends in conspiracy. Not every neglected daughter becomes a thief. Not every manipulator finds a willing stage. Specific decisions built this. Repeated decisions. That mattered more than retroactively staining every vacation photo. The Whitakers aged 5 years in one season. Harold had a minor stroke during pretrial and came out of rehab angrier than weaker, which was probably the only reason he recovered as well as he did. June wrote me handwritten notes every few weeks apologizing for the kitchen, for the lie, for not noticing, for still loving her daughter and granddaughter despite everything. I wrote back every time. None of it was their fault. That was true, and I made sure they heard it from me, because families can generate extra victims indefinitely if nobody interrupts the shame machine. Ed Lawson stayed on the board and became one of the unexpected helpers of my second year. The company changed too. For a while, employees tiptoed. Then they overcompensated with concern. Then normalcy slowly returned in layers. I moved passwords off family devices, created real dual controls, separated every personal and corporate channel that had once bled together because trust felt efficient. A consultant later described it as healthy governance. I called it learning not to leave the back door open because the house once felt safe. I testified in 2 related proceedings after the criminal case, one involving the shell entities, another involving insurance fraud exposure around the policy change. Daniel's broader pattern surfaced more there. Other names, other clients, not identical stories, familiar structure, health event, concern, documentation, temporary support, access. He had not always gone as far as he went with me, but he had always been walking the same road. Predators do not invent themselves anew for every victim. They refine. The one thing I did not do was become a public crusader immediately. A few journalists wanted the story. A podcast producer called twice. One business magazine offered a long-form feature about cognitive manipulation in succession planning. I said no to all of it for almost a year. Not because I was ashamed, because I did not yet know how to tell the story without accidentally giving them one final thing. My voice. Eventually I would talk, but not while rage still had the steering wheel. The first Christmas after sentencing I spent at the lake house alone, except for Harold and June joining me for dinner. We ate too much roast chicken. Harold cursed the Seahawks. June burned the rolls and blamed her oven. Snow started around 8 and turned the deck white. At one point, June looked at the empty place where Marianne would usually have sat and quietly said, "I still love her." I said, "I know." Then she asked, "Does that make me disloyal to you?" That question broke my heart more gently than any courtroom ever did. "No," I told her. "Love isn't a verdict." That is the kind of sentence you learn only after the legal parts are done. By spring, the nightmares had reduced from nightly to weekly. By summer, I could walk into the dining room without hearing the cuffs first. By fall, I finally did something I had avoided for months. I opened the safe, took out my father's fountain pen, and signed the papers for the Spokane yard expansion. The real papers. My name, my authority, my decision. No consultant, no family pressure, no journal, no continuity language. Just me. I cannot explain how satisfying ink can feel when you nearly lost the right to use it. The last legal thing Marianne ever asked from me came 4 months after sentencing. Not through a dramatic letter, not through an ambush, through Teresa, as everything did by then. Marianne wanted 10 minutes in person before the divorce was finalized. Teresa said no on instinct. I surprised both of us by saying yes, not because reconciliation interested me. Because unfinished ruins keep calling your attention back to them until you walk through one last time and confirm there is nothing living inside. We met at a private room in Teresa's office. No wine, no memory lane, no music from some shared restaurant we used to love. Just gray walls, a box of tissues nobody touched, and 2 chairs angled like compromise had once been imagined there and abandoned. Marianne looked older in a way prison does not cause and courts do not fully explain. Consequences age people. So does finally seeing yourself through the eyes of the person you helped dismantle. She did not begin with apology. That interested me. She began with a question. "Do you believe I ever loved you?" I sat there for a long second before answering. "Yes," I said. "I also believe you loved the version of me easiest to live beside. And when that version got harder to reach, you let somebody else teach you how to replace me instead of how to speak to me." She nodded slowly, as if that was more merciful than she had expected. Then she told me something I had not known. The first time Daniel kissed her was not in our house or after some emotionally charged evening. It was in a parking lot after one of my follow-up appointments. She had been crying in the car because I had snapped at her over directions and then apologized too late to erase the damage. Daniel had leaned in through the open door to ask if she was all right, and instead of backing away, he kissed her once and said, "You do not have to keep being the only adult in this story." She said that sentence hit her with almost physical force, not because it was true in any objective sense, because she had felt alone long enough to need permission to turn bitterness into identity. He gave her that permission. Then he took everything else. I listened without interrupting. When she was done, I asked only one question. "Why didn't you stop when the papers started getting real?" She closed her eyes, because by then stopping meant admitting what I had already done to get there. There it was. The answer to more crimes than most people realize. Not hunger, not lust, not even greed at the deepest level. Escalation through sunk cost. She had lied, so more lying became easier than confession. She had logged false observations, so forged forms became easier than admitting the journal was poison. She had let Daniel in, so protecting Daniel became tangled up with protecting her own self-image. Once you understand that, half of adult tragedy gets simpler. People do monstrous things not merely to get what they want. They do them to avoid facing who they have already become. I did not forgive her in that room, but I did gain the final piece I needed for my own exit. I no longer believed there was some hidden pristine version of our marriage buried under Daniel's manipulation, waiting to be excavated, if only I grieved hard enough. No. The marriage had already contained absences. Daniel simply industrialized them. That distinction set me free. When the meeting ended, Marianne stood and asked, "Do you think Chloe will ever come back from this?" The question was so heartbreakingly maternal that I almost hated her again just for making me hear it. "I don't know," I said. "That depends on whether she ever learns the difference between being wounded and being entitled to wound." Marianne cried then, quietly. No performance left in it. I left her there with Teresa and never met with her privately again. The divorce finalized 6 weeks later. I kept the house, sold the lake property anyway because some landscapes become too crowded with ghosts no matter how legally clear their title is, put part of the recovered funds into the Spokane yard and part into a foundation grant for trade school apprentices from families going through guardianship abuse, medical exploitation, or household financial coercion. Why that foundation? Because revenge that ends only in prison keeps too much of its energy facing backward. I wanted at least one part of mine to face forward. And because somewhere between Dr. Rowe, Teresa, Victor, and the endless paperwork, I had realized how many people never catch the kitchen conversation in time. How many sign? How many trust? How many let respectable themes become cages? I could not save all of them, but I could fund one more lawyer, one more evaluator, one more investigator who knows what to ask when concern starts arriving with sudden authority and strangely prepared forms. That, too, is part of the ending. Not soft, not saintly, practical, which is the only kind of healing I ever really believed in. The morning after the dinner, I walked into Halston Freight and Supply before sunrise. Not because I had slept, because I had not. The security lights were still on across the Tacoma yard, damp gravel, forklifts lined up, the office windows black except for the faint glow in dispatch where Ramon had started coffee for the early crews. For 32 years, I had entered that building as the man who knew what the day belonged to. That morning, I entered as the man who had just proven, to police and prosecutors and his own board, that people closest to him had been building a formal case to take his name off the door while he was still alive. Nothing in business school prepares you for that version of governance risk. Ramon looked up when I came through the front office. His face changed instantly. He had already heard enough overnight to know something terrible had happened, but not enough to know how to stand near it. "Morning, boss," he said. I nodded. "Is anyone else here yet?" "Diane, maybe 10 minutes ago. Matt's on the yard. Nobody's asked questions." That was one of the reasons I had kept Ramon for 15 years. He understood that there are mornings for information and mornings for containment. Diane Porter, my operations director, was in the conference room with 2 legal pads, her laptop open, and the expression of a woman who had spent half the night deciding which fires could wait until daylight. She stood when I entered. "Tell me how bad." That was Diane, too. No sympathy first, usable facts first, so I gave them to her. Police intervention, financial exploitation, forged medical context, asset exposure, Daniel's role, Chloe's role, the board packet they had prepared. The fact that I was not stepping aside and had no intention of entertaining any protective language drafted in my name. Diane listened, took 2 pages of notes, and then asked the only question that mattered for the company in the next 12 hours. Do we have a hostile narrative coming before lunch? Probably. From family or from counsel? Both if they're smart, she nodded once. Then we move first. By 7:15, Teresa had joined us by secure call. By 7:32, the board had an emergency notice in their inboxes calling for an executive session at 9 under council supervision. By 7:40, Diane had a draft message ready for senior staff. Not a dramatic message, not a confessional one, a narrow one. There is an active legal matter involving a fraudulent attempt to misstate Mr. Halston's cognitive capacity and interfere with company control. Mr. Halston remains in full authority. Council has advised limited internal discussion until formal statements are issued. Normal operations continue. Normal operations continue. There's something brutally comic about that phrase after a family coup attempt. But companies need ordinary sentences, even when the people inside them do not feel ordinary at all. At 8:10, one of the first external tremors hit. An email from Chloe, not to me, to Diane, copied to 2 board members she thought still leaned toward caution over loyalty. She wrote that I had experienced a severe psychological break at dinner. She described Daniel as a professional consultant who had been trying to help the family manage my decline. She implied that I had staged the confrontation in front of police during a moment of paranoia and had become physically threatening. She attached part of the same packet Daniel had shown me at dinner, only stripped down to the pages that made me look most vulnerable. Old note about fatigue, missed dentist appointment, blood pressure spike, medication list without context. It would have been effective on strangers. That is what terrified me. Diane forwarded it to Teresa with one line, trying to outrun the arrest report. Please ruin her day. Teresa called me 30 seconds later, laughing in the kind of hard way lawyers laugh when their opponent has just done something that will age badly under oath. Your daughter just circulated forged medical insinuation after live police intervention and before council review. That was stupid, even by ambitious child standards. Then her voice flattened. Richard, listen carefully. Today will matter more than last night in one very specific way. Dinner proved the betrayal. This morning proves whether the company becomes another crime scene or stays a company. You do not disappear into private grief until after the board sees you standing. So I stood. 9 o'clock board meetings usually smell like stale coffee and strategic cowardice. This one smelled like rain, printer heat, and panic. 7 members in person, 2 on video. Teresa at my right hand. Diane along the wall with operational files. Every face looking at me as if they were trying to decide how much of the rumor had already entered the room before I did. I did not waste time. Last night, my wife, my daughter, and a consultant named Daniel Voss were confronted in my home during a coordinated attempt to use fabricated cognitive decline to influence company control and personal asset transfer. Police were present. Evidence was secured. Council is now moving on both the criminal and civil sides. I am not stepping down, not being evaluated at the direction of anyone in that conspiracy, and not consenting to any provisional structure drafted by family members or outside advisors. If any of you received material suggesting otherwise, give it to Teresa now. Silence. Then paper moving. Then 2 members sliding envelopes across the table. One had received the packet 3 weeks earlier. The other had received a softer verbal briefing from Daniel over lunch about succession preparedness in light of observed executive fatigue. There it was. The outer ring of the scheme. Not just my house, my board, my signature authority, my vendors, my future. A man named Howard Briggs, who had served on the board longer than some marriages last, cleared his throat and said, "Did anyone here actually believe Voss?" Nobody answered right away. That told its own truth. Finally, Elaine Mercer, our most cautious board member, and the one Chloe had counted on, said, "I believed enough of it to want more information." He was measured. He had notes. He used a physician's name. He didn't sound like a con man. He sounded like a man giving us warning before a public embarrassment. Exactly, Teresa said. That is why fraud built on concern is so effective. It borrows the tone of prudence. By the end of the meeting, the board passed a formal resolution reaffirming my authority, invalidating any external advisory role Daniel had claimed, freezing all non-routine transfer approvals above a threshold until forensic review completed, and authorizing emergency internal audit support. I signed that resolution with a hand that shook less than I feared it would. That mattered more than I expected. Because the whole structure Daniel had been building depended on one assumption. That if enough doubt gathered around me, my own hand would eventually start looking suspicious even to me. Instead, my signature held. At 10:53, Teresa took a call and stepped into the hallway. When she came back, her expression had changed. "Marianne wants to talk, not with you, with me." I said nothing. "She's asking whether immediate cooperation changes exposure. There are sentences that reveal whole marriages in one breath. That was one. Not is Richard all right, not how do I fix what I've done. not how badly did Chloe destroy herself. Exposure. Tell her yes, I said. Teresa watched me for a second. You sure? No, but tell her yes anyway. That afternoon I met Dr. Rumer, Helen Rowe, in person for the first time. Until then, she had been a voice, a statement, a credential. Daniel liked to borrow without permission. In real life, she was shorter than I expected, steel gray hair, clear eyes, and the kind of face that makes you feel silly for trying to perform confusion in front of her. She had agreed to help because once Teresa laid out the materials, Dr. Rose saw what Daniel had done not merely as fraud against me, but as contamination of medicine itself. She spread the copied packet pages across her office table and tapped them one by one. This phrase was never mine. Tap. This notation about executive instability is meaningless in clinical terms as written. It only sounds impressive to non-medical readers. Tap. This reference to a pattern review does not correspond to any legitimate neurological assessment framework I use or know. Tap. And this is my favorite. Observed episodic competency fracture. That is not a medical phrase. That is a manipulator's phrase wearing a white coat. Her contempt steadied me. Then she said something that stayed with me through trial. Men like Voss do not merely lie about medical matters. They take advantage of the fact that most healthy people are secretly afraid of their own minds betraying them one day. He sold that fear back to your family. Yes, that was exactly what he had done. He had taken the universal human terror of slipping and turned it into a business language around my house. By Wednesday, the search warrants had opened more than we expected. Daniel's office computers held template folders. Not just mine. Draft capacity narratives. Suggested language for family concern. Observed incident logs with blank spaces where names could be inserted. Consultation frameworks built around phrases like decision fatigue, executive rigidity, compensatory recall failure, spouse burden escalation. I sat in Teresa's office reading those headers and felt my stomach turn. Maybe I had not been his first target. Maybe I had only been the richest one he thought he could finish. We did not need to prove a whole pattern for my case to hold. Still, seeing the templates mattered. Because it meant my destruction had not been uniquely inspired. It had been process-ready. That is the ugliest part of certain kinds of evil. Not passion, repeatability. Marianne's first formal cooperation session lasted almost 6 hours. I was not there. I did not want to be. But Teresa walked me through it afterward. Marianne admitted Daniel had been privately briefing her for months about what he called my erosion markers. She admitted he told her that high performers often hide decline until the financial damage becomes irreversible. She admitted she started saving ordinary domestic moments in a notebook because he framed that as protective spouse documentation. Forgot where glasses were, repeated a story, snapped at a waiter, needed a nap after travel, missed a dentist appointment, rubbed forehead during calls. Every marriage on earth can produce 10 such entries by Tuesday. Daniel had simply taught her to see them as pre-collapse evidence. The most useful part of Marianne's statement came when Teresa asked exactly when she crossed from concern into cooperation. Marianne cried before answering, then said, "When Daniel told me Richard would hate me at first, but thank me later once someone finally forced structure around him." That line hurt not because it excused her, because it revealed how betrayal often walks into a marriage, not always through resentment, sometimes through vanity. The vanity of believing you alone are brave enough to do what love supposedly requires. I wish I could tell you that understanding this made me gentler toward her. It did not then. Understanding motive and forgiving motive are not the same job. The first time I saw Chloe after the dinner was not in court. It was through glass, county holding room, 47 hours after the arrest. Not because she wanted to see me, because her lawyer thought a show of remorse might soften the immediate financial injunction hearing. Teresa advised against going. I went anyway. Chloe sat on the other side of reinforced glass in jail-issued clothing, too plain for the daughter I knew. No makeup, hair pulled back wrong, eyes swollen from crying or lack of sleep or both. For a moment, I saw the child who used to slide folded notes under my office door asking for $10 for school fundraisers and $30 for movie nights, and $100 because apparently winter formal flowers had joined organized crime. Then she spoke. "Dad, I know how this looks." And the child was gone. Because that sentence told me she still believed presentation was the central problem. I picked up the phone on my side of the glass. "This is not about how it looks," I said. "This is about what you did." She started crying immediately, hard, real enough that another father might have mistaken it for the center of the story. "I thought he loved me," she said. There it was. Not remorse for the drugging, not horror at the forged packet, not grief over my company. He loved me, or did not. Daniel had arranged her moral universe around romantic selection, and she had agreed to finance it with my life. "He told me you would recover once the pressure was gone," she said. He said you were making everyone smaller. He said Mom had been disappearing for years. He said if I didn't act, we'd all lose everything because you'd never let go until there was nothing left to save. I listened. Not because it softened me, because I wanted to hear how language survives even after handcuffs. And the sedative, I asked. She shut her eyes. He said it would only make you foggy. And if it didn't? No answer. And the board packet? Tears again. He said timing mattered. Timing, always the same clean little word doing the work of conscience. I leaned toward the glass. You know what I can't get past, Chloe? Not the money, not even the consultant. It's this. At any point, you could have looked at me and decided I was still a person before I was an obstacle. You kept choosing obstacle. That finally landed. I saw it on her face. Not redemption, recognition. She whispered, I didn't think you'd hear them in time. That sentence stayed with me longer than almost anything else she said, not because it shocked me, because it was the purest summary of the scheme. A family plot built on the assumption that my life would be rearranged before I could hear the sentence finish. After the injunction hearing froze the remaining shell accounts, Harold and June Whitaker asked to see me. I almost refused. Then I thought about kitchens, gates, old holiday tables, and the cost of leaving one more truth unspoken. So I went. June opened the door looking 20 years older than she had the week before. Harold did not try to hug me. For once, he had the sense not to reach. We sat in the same living room where the game show had played while my legal extinction was being discussed in the kitchen. The television was dark now. Everything else looked the same. That made it unbearable. June cried first. Of course she did. Harold stared at the rug and said, I told myself they were overmanaging, not plotting. That sounded honest. Also worthless. Did you know they weren't sick that morning? I asked. Yes, June whispered. Did you know why I wasn't supposed to come? She hesitated 1 second too long, then said, Not fully. Enough to know it wasn't right. There are forms of guilt that deserve patience. That one did not. You let your house become part of it, I said. June sobbed harder. Harold said, I thought Daniel was helping them manage a hard truth. I almost laughed. Almost. A hard truth. Harold, a hard truth is cancer. A hard truth is bankruptcy. A hard truth is your kid wrecking a car. This was not a hard truth. This was a fabricated story with coffee service. Neither of them defended themselves after that. Good. They had done enough of that already inside their own heads. I left after 12 minutes. Long enough to say what needed saying. Too short for absolution. The company settled into a strange new rhythm through autumn. Everything worked. Nothing felt normal. Vendors called carefully. Competitors sniffed around the edges of rumor. 2 longtime clients privately asked whether succession concerns might affect contract timing. I answered both in person and got the business anyway, though one of them looked at me a beat too long before signing, and I knew exactly what he was wondering. That was another layer of damage Daniel never had to explain. Even failed cognitive allegations leave residue. So I did something pride once would have refused. I got ahead of it. At our annual leadership retreat in October, I stood in front of 23 senior employees and told them a shortened, clean version. Not every family detail, not every humiliation, just enough. A manipulative consultant exploited private family strain, misused medical language, and tried to influence authority structures around me and the company. The attempt failed. Systems have been tightened, documentation protocols are changing. Any future external concern about my capacity or the capacity of any executive comes through real medical channels and legal counsel only. Then I added the part that made the room trust me again. And for the record, if any of you ever hear a man using soft concern and vague clinical vocabulary to angle himself toward my signature authority, you have permission to throw him out before I get there. That got the first genuine laugh I had heard in a work setting in months. I needed it more than I admitted. November brought the first major plea discussions. Daniel refused. Of course he did. Men built out of control rarely mistake narrowing options for accountability until a jury physically hands it to them. Chloe wavered. Some days she wanted a deal. Some days she wanted to believe Daniel would still rescue the story. Some days, Teresa said, she sounded less like a criminal defendant than like a discarded recruit still waiting for the cult leader to correct the misunderstanding. That was probably true. Marianne did not ask to see me again until just before Christmas. I declined. She sent a handwritten letter instead. 7 pages. Apology, memory, explanation, self-accusation, attempts at language, failures of language. I read it once, then put it in a drawer. Not because it had no value, because some documents arrive too early for the part of you they need. Christmas itself was obscene in its normality. Lights downtown, packages arriving, people saying safe, cheerful things in grocery lines. The world once again proving it can continue alongside private wreckage with no coordination whatsoever. I had dinner at my sister Paula's house. Nothing fancy. Ham too dry, nieces too loud. a dog under the table committing food crimes with total confidence. About halfway through dessert, Paula touched my wrist and said, "You still keep looking over your shoulder when you set something down." She was right. I did. When someone you trust uses ordinary domestic space as delivery system for strategy, you do not stop scanning trays and folders just because a calendar says holiday. The first time I noticed that reflex easing was absurd. January. Airport Hotel in Spokane. I left my room key in the elevator and only realized it 3 floors later. For 2 full seconds, I felt the old freezing thought: evidence, pattern, decline. Then I walked back, asked at the desk, got the key, and nothing happened. No narrative formed around it. No packet grew 2 pages. No consultant breathed meaning into it. It was just a forgotten key. That was when I understood how total the contamination had become. They had not only tried to take my assets, they had colonized the interpretation layer of ordinary life. So part of recovery, humiliating as it sounds, became relearning proportion. A forgotten key is a forgotten key. A headache is a headache. Fatigue after travel is fatigue after travel. A repeated story at dinner is an aging human being doing what aging human beings do, not a legal event waiting for a witness statement. I wish I could say I mastered that quickly. I did not. At trial, the extra material from Daniel's office turned out to matter more than Teresa originally expected. Not because the jury needed to believe he had done it before, because the templates showed mindset. He did not merely improvise a family crisis into advantage. He saw autonomy as editable. Dana, in one of the cleanest prosecutorial sequences I have ever heard, laid 3 documents side by side. 1 blank template from Daniel's office. 1 customized packet page about me. 1 actual note from my wife's journal. Template. Adaptation. Insertion. Then she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Concern did not create this file. This file recruited Concern, stripped it for parts, and turned it into leverage." That sentence deserved an engraved plaque. During cross-examination, Daniel tried once more to wear expertise like armor. He spoke about executive fatigue, spouse distress, succession anxiety, crisis containment, and patient family resistance. Then Dana asked the question he could not survive. "Mr. Voss, when you texted Ms. Halston, 'Keep the dose low, we need fog, not an ambulance,' were you acting as a clinician, a family friend, a consultant, or a man trying to make a competent adult appear medically unsafe for strategic gain?" He opened his mouth, closed it, adjusted his tie, looked toward the judge, not because he had an answer, because he did not. The courtroom understood that silence exactly correctly. Sentencing produced one more wound I did not expect. Victim impact statements. I gave mine standing, no notes, no flourish. I talked about authorship. How strange it is to wake inside a life others are already annotating on your behalf. How medical language can become domestic violence when it is weaponized inside marriage. How a daughter can mistake proximity to strategy for adulthood. How money loss was never the deepest injury, because money can be counted while autonomy gets eroded in teaspoons and named concern all the way down. When I finished, I looked directly at Daniel and said, "You were wrong about one thing from the start. You thought if doubt entered me, it would keep serving you. It didn't. It taught me how carefully men like you build cages." He looked down for the first time in the whole hearing. That was enough. Chloe spoke after me. Her statement was a wreck, not because she lacked feeling, because feeling and accountability were still fighting for the same small space inside her. She said she loved me. She said she lost herself. She said Daniel saw her when no one else did. She said my intensity had always scared her. She said none of that justified what she did. All of that was probably true in fragments. None of it changed the sentence. After sentencing, I went back to the house alone for the first time in months. The legal restrictions had been sorted. The rooms were mine again in the clean, boring property sense. But houses do not revert emotionally just because title does. I stood in the kitchen where Marianne had once kissed me with flour on her cheek after ruining a pie crust and laughing at herself. Then I stood in the same kitchen where Daniel's packet pages had lain on my table during discovery review. 1 room, 2 histories, neither canceling the other. I opened every drawer, not looking for evidence, looking for ghosts. Then I did something Teresa later called theatrically practical. I changed the locks, changed the table, changed the kitchen chairs, and had the dining room refinished. Not because wood remembers, because I did. And some surfaces ask too much of memory if you leave them exactly as they were. The old dining table, the one where the dinner happened, went to a women's legal aid resale warehouse through the foundation. When the movers carried it out, I expected grief. What I felt was relief. There are objects that become too loyal to the worst version of a room. That table had earned exile. Spring brought depositions from people Daniel had once circled, but not completed. 2 families, 1 minor executive, no full criminal parallels, still enough to show appetite. Men like him do not need to finish every scheme to reveal what kind of mind they own. I funded the foundation in Evelyn Halston's name. Not Marianne's, not the company's, Evelyn's. My mother. The woman who used to say paperwork is where cowards try to look brave. She had never met Daniel. She would have hated him on sight. That felt right. By summer, 3 small grants had gone out. One for an independent neuropsych evaluation in a guardianship dispute. One for forensic accounting in a coercive care case. One for emergency counsel where a spouse had started using medical language and hidden transfers in the same month. Tiny work. Important work. At the first foundation briefing, a young attorney asked me why I had cared so much about preserving the sentence structure of ordinary life in the outreach materials. Why phrases like confused, fragile, intermittently impaired, concerned spouse had to be explained so carefully. I told her this, because cages built from steel announce themselves. Cages built from interpretation try to move in looking like concern. If our language gets lazy, their language wins twice. She wrote that down. Good. Some lessons deserve to survive you. Even now, the hardest moments are stupidly small. A doctor saying follow up, an intake form asking about memory, a waiter saying, "Sir, you already told me that," a friend suggesting I slow down. All of those phrases carry old static sometimes. All of them can wake the ghost of Daniel's voice for half a second, but ghosts lose power when named quickly, so I name them quickly. That is another practical thing healing turned out to be. Not transcendence, not wisdom, fast naming. This is tiredness, not decline. This is grief, not incompetence. This is age, not surrender. This is one repeated story, not a file. And every time I do that, the room they tried to build around me gets a little smaller. There was one more hearing before the verdict that deserves to be remembered because it taught me something ugly about respectability. Civil capacity injunction review, not criminal court, not the dramatic room, just a cleaner, quieter hearing where people in nice shoes tried to discuss whether the emergency packet Daniel built had ever had any serious basis. Elaine from the board testified. Dr. Rowe testified. Teresa walked the judge through the packet architecture. Then June Whitaker took the stand. I had not expected her to matter much. I was wrong. June looked small under oath, not weak, just exposed in the way older people sometimes look when the house language they have relied on for decades stops working in public. Teresa asked only a few questions. Did you know you were not sick that morning? Yes. Did you hear Daniel discuss court control language in your kitchen? Yes. Did you say anything to stop the meeting? No. Why not? Because Marianne said it was for Richard's own good and Chloe said it had already gone too far to keep pretending. Too far to keep pretending. That phrase hit the courtroom harder than I expected, because it revealed something essential. They were no longer merely collecting concern. They were moving into execution, and the adults in the room knew it. The judge eventually used a phrase I wrote down later. Concern cannot become pretext by repetition and still claim moral cover. Good. That line deserved to exist outside my own anger. By then, the local business paper had gotten hold of enough fragments to call asking for comment. If I said nothing, rumor would eat me in small bites. If I said too much, the criminal case could get muddy. So Teresa drafted a statement and made me strip every ounce of wounded pride out of it. A former outside consultant engaged in fraudulent conduct involving fabricated wellness concerns and unauthorized financial interference. The matter is now in the hands of law enforcement and the courts. Halston Freight and Supply remains stable, fully operating, and committed to disciplined governance. Disciplined governance. That was the phrase investors wanted. Not heartbreak, not family catastrophe. Governance. I hated that. I also respected it. The world does not stop needing clean language simply because your private life has exploded. A week after that statement ran, I was pumping diesel receipts into the accounting scanner when one of our drivers, a man named Cal, who had worked routes for me since Chloe was in middle school, paused in the doorway and said, "Boss, for whatever it's worth, none of us thought you were losing it. We just thought rich people had invented a new kind of meeting." I laughed harder than the line deserved. Maybe because humor from working men sometimes arrives closer to dignity than sympathy does. Then came discovery from Marianne's phone. I almost wish it had not. Not because it weakened the case, because it filled in tenderness where I would have preferred only malice. There were texts from Daniel to her at 1 a.m. saying things like, "You have carried this family alone for too long. He only hears force now. The kindest people are often the last to act." Predatory lines, obvious once stripped from context, still effective because they were aimed at the exact wound she had been nursing for years, while I mistook endurance for agreement. Understanding that cost me something. Not the case. Something more annoying. Simplistic hatred. Simplistic hatred is easier to live with. Complicated hatred makes room for your own omissions. I did not enjoy that room. In late February, Teresa made me attend one session with a trauma specialist who worked with fraud victims, coercive control survivors, and executives who had been targeted through medical or legal manipulation. I told her I was not a trauma language man. She said, "That sentence alone practically confirms you need the appointment." Dr. Syra Manon had shelves full of books I immediately distrusted and an office window looking over wet pines. I expected breathing exercises and phrases like hold space. Instead, she asked one brutal practical question: what part of your day still feels occupied by them even when they are not physically present? Occupied. Yes, that was the right word. So I answered honestly. Breakfast trays, follow-up emails with clinical phrases, misplaced keys, public speaking before donor groups, any room where paper packets get slid across wood. She nodded and said, "Good, then your work is not to become unafraid. Your work is to repossess interpretation." That sentence helped me more than half the respectable advice I had received all year. Repossess interpretation. Not erase the memory, not transcend the damage. Take back the right to say what a moment means. By the time trial closed, I had started using that language privately. The board packet was a packet, not a prophecy. A drugged drink was a crime, not evidence that I seemed fragile. My wife's notebook was a manipulated instrument, not a mirror. Words matter, especially after someone nearly takes your life by rewording it. By summer, 3 small grants had gone out. One for an independent neuropsych evaluation in a guardianship dispute. One for forensic accounting in a coercive care case. One for emergency counsel where a spouse had started using medical language and hidden transfers in the same month. Tiny work. Important work. At the first foundation briefing, a young attorney asked me why I had cared so much about preserving the sentence structure of ordinary life in the outreach materials. Why phrases like confused, fragile, intermittently impaired, concerned spouse had to be explained so carefully. I told her this, because cages built from steel announce themselves. Cages built from interpretation try to move in looking like concern. If our language gets lazy, their language wins twice. She wrote that down. Good. Some lessons deserve to survive you. 1 year after the dinner, I recorded a voice memo for myself. Not therapy homework, not legal archive. Just a private marker because I no longer trusted memory to organize certain years without help. I sat in my study with the window cracked, a mug of black coffee cooling on the desk, and said, "My name is Richard Halston. 1 year ago, my wife and daughter tried to have me declared unfit so they could control my company, my assets, and eventually my future. My daughter drugged me in public. A man named Daniel Voss translated family weakness into a business model. I survived. I remained myself. They did not get the company. They did not get the house. They did not get the right to define my mind. I stopped there at first. Then I started again and said the part I almost deleted. I still miss them. Not the criminals. Not the alliance. The wife who laughed the night our basement flooded and we made cocktails in rubber boots because nothing else could be done until morning. The daughter who once built a cardboard city under the dining room table and insisted every stuffed animal needed zoning permits. Those people may not be fully real anymore in the form I want them to be, but grief does not care whether love later became contaminated. I saved the voice memo anyway, because truth gets stronger when it can hold contradiction without collapsing. The final scene I keep is not the verdict, not the sentencing, not even the moment Daniel's face broke when Elise walked through my door. It is smaller, late October. Rain again, because of course it was rain. I was at the Spokane yard under construction, standing in wet gravel beside steel beams and half-framed office walls, wearing boots too good for mud because I had come straight from a bank meeting. One of our younger project managers, Luis, waved me over to look at the new loading configuration. He was 30 and smarter than I had been at 30, which is how progress is supposed to work. As he talked through the site plan, I forgot for half a second where I had set my keys. Just half a second. A perfectly ordinary lapse. I felt the old panic start, the old poison, the whisper, "See, maybe they were right." Then I reached into my left coat pocket, found the keys exactly where I had put them, and laughed out loud in the rain like a man losing his mind in the nicest possible way. Luis looked at me oddly. "You okay, Richard?" "Yes," I said, "better than okay." Because that was the true revenge in the end, not prison. Though prison mattered, not repayment. Though repayment mattered, not public humiliation. Though God knows there was plenty. The true revenge was this. They tried to turn my own mind into the weapon that removed me from my life. They failed. They tried to use paperwork, concern, sedatives, sex, loneliness, resentment, and a dozen polished euphemisms to make me surrender authorship of my own name. They failed. They built an entire plan around the assumption that once doubt entered me, it would never leave. They were wrong. A year later, the company still carried my name. The yard still opened under my signature. The lake house still stood. The neurologist whose name they borrowed testified under oath that I was sound. The man who sold wellness as camouflage woke up in a prison cell. The daughter who mistook theft for justice had to live with a sentence and her own words. And the woman who let herself become the witness against me lived long enough to understand that being chosen by a manipulator is not the same as being loved. People ask sometimes, usually quietly and usually after a second drink, whether I ever forgave them. I do not answer the same way every time. Forgiveness is not a switch, and it is not owed. What I can say is simpler. I release their right to narrate me. That is enough for now. If this story does anything useful, I hope it teaches one thing. Concern can be a costume. Documentation can be a weapon, and family tables are not always safe simply because they hold familiar plates. Trust should never mean unread papers. Love should never mean surrendering consent. And if somebody around you keeps translating your ordinary human imperfections into a coordinated case against your autonomy, do not wait for the second incident, or the next packet, or the next dinner, or the next polished explanation. Look closer. Ask who benefits from your supposed instability. Ask where the money went. Ask why support keeps arriving with signatures attached. Ask, most of all, whether the people telling you they are protecting you have already started speaking as if your voice is optional. My name is Richard Halston. A stranger once sat in my mother-in-law's kitchen and explained how easy it would be to erase me with the right journal, the right dosage, and 2 more public incidents. He was wrong. I heard him before he finished the sentence, and after that, I made sure the next family dinner belonged to me.